The ancient bells of St. Bartholomew's Church had been scheduled to ring their joyous peal at precisely 11:30 on that crisp October morning in 1934, announcing to all of Mayfair that Miss Honoria Ashworth had become the bride of Captain Reginald Pemberton. Instead, those same bronze voices remained silent, their celebration still borne by circumstances that would soon challenge the very foundations of logical thought. The wedding had promised to be the social event of the season. The Gothic splendor of St. Bartholomew's provided the perfect backdrop for the union of two distinguished families, the Ashworths, whose textile fortune had built half of Manchester, and the Pembertons, whose naval tradition stretched back to Nelson himself. Every detail had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Cascades of white roses and stephanotis adorned the ancient pillars, their fragrance mingling with the lingering incense of centuries. A string quartet positioned discreetly in the north transept had rehearsed their selections with meticulous care, and the cream of London society filled the oak pews, their silk and mourning coats rustling with anticipation. Captain Pemberton stood at the altar in his dress naval uniform, the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows, catching the gold braid on his shoulders. He was a man of 32, with the weathered complexion of one who had spent years at sea and the steady bearing that came from commanding men in dangerous waters. His dark eyes, which had gazed across storm-tossed oceans, now fixed upon the vestry door with an intensity that seemed almost excessive for the occasion. In the front pew, Lady Margaret Ashworth sat with the rigid composure of a woman accustomed to command. Her steel-gray hair was arranged with mathematical precision beneath a hat of midnight blue, and her pale eyes surveyed the congregation with the calculating gaze of a general reviewing troops. Beside her, Sir Edmund Ashworth fidgeted with his pocket watch, his florid face betraying an uncharacteristic nervousness. The textile magnate, who had negotiated with mill owners and union leaders with equal aplomb, seemed oddly diminished in the sacred space. Miss Sylvia Carfax, the maid of honor, stood near the vestry entrance, her bouquet of pink roses trembling slightly in her gloved hands. She was a pretty girl of 23, with fair hair and the kind of delicate features that photograph well in society magazines. Yet there was something in her expression, a tightness around her blue eyes, a barely perceptible tremor at the corner of her mouth, that suggested emotions more complex than mere wedding-day excitement. The Honorable Julian Ashworth, Honoria's younger brother, lounged in the second pew with the studied nonchalance of a man who owed money to half the gentlemen's clubs in London. His handsome face bore the pallor of too many late nights and too much champagne, and his fingers drummed a restless tattoo against his prayer book. Beside him sat Mr. Bernard Phipps, the family solicitor, whose thin frame was draped in funeral black despite the joyous occasion, and whose pale eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of the proceedings with professional interest. At 11:28, when the bride should have been making her final preparations, Miss Carfax approached the vestry door and knocked gently. "Honoria, darling, it's time." No response came from within. Miss Carfax knocked again, more firmly this time, and called out with forced cheerfulness, "The captain is looking quite splendid in his uniform. You mustn't keep him waiting much longer." Still silence. The congregation began to shift restlessly, their murmurs creating a susurrus of unease that seemed to echo in the vaulted ceiling. Lady Ashworth rose from her pew with the deliberate grace of a woman who had never allowed circumstances to dictate her actions, and approached the vestry door herself. "Honoria," she called, her voice carrying the authority that had cowed servants and society matrons alike. "Open this door immediately." When no answer came, she tried the handle. The door was locked. Old Thomas Whitmore, the church sexton who had served St. Bartholomew's for 47 years, shuffled forward with the ponderous dignity of age. The brass key that unlocked the vestry door hung from a chain attached to his waistcoat, the same chain and the same key that had secured countless brides in their final moments of preparation. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he wheezed, "but I locked the door myself not 20 minutes past, just as Miss Honoria requested. Said she needed a few moments of quiet before the ceremony." With trembling fingers, he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed church. Lady Ashworth pushed the door wide, and what they saw within defied all rational explanation. The vestry was empty. Honoria's wedding dress lay spread across the oak bench like a discarded chrysalis, the ivory silk and Belgian lace arranged with an almost ceremonial precision. Her pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had adorned 3 generations of Ashworth brides, coiled beside the gown like a serpent of accusation. Her satin slippers sat neatly paired beneath the bench, and her bridal bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms rested upon the small table, its ribbons still perfectly arranged. But of Honoria herself, there was no trace. The vestry's single window was not only locked from the inside, but was far too narrow for any adult to pass through, and it looked out onto a sheer drop to the churchyard below. The walls were solid stone, dating back to the 13th century, and offered no conceivable means of escape. The door through which they had just entered was the only way in or out, and Whitmore swore upon his mother's grave that it had remained locked from the moment he had secured it. Captain Pemberton pushed past the others and stepped into the empty room, his naval training asserting itself in the face of the impossible. He examined the window, tested the stones of the wall, and even looked up at the vaulted ceiling as though expecting to find some secret passage. His movements were methodical, professional, but his face had taken on the pallor of a man confronting something that challenged his understanding of the natural world. "This is preposterous," Lady Ashworth declared, though her voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "People do not simply vanish into thin air. There must be an explanation." Miss Carfax had begun to weep quietly, though whether from grief or some other emotion was difficult to determine. "She was here," she whispered. "I helped her with the final adjustments to her veil not 30 minutes ago. She was nervous, yes, but she was here." "Nervous about what?" Captain Pemberton asked sharply, his eyes fixing on the maid of honor with an intensity that made her step backward. "The usual things," Miss Carfax replied, her voice barely audible. "Any bride would be nervous. It's only natural." But Julian Ashworth, who had remained silent until now, gave a bitter laugh that echoed strangely in the stone chamber. "Natural," he said. "Nothing about this family has been natural for years." The search that followed was thorough but fruitless. The church was examined from crypt to bell tower, the surrounding grounds were scoured, and the nearby streets were canvassed by hastily summoned constables. But Honoria Ashworth had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only her wedding finery and a mystery that seemed to mock the very notion of rational explanation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ancient churchyard, Sir Edmund Ashworth made a decision that would prove fateful. Drawing Mr. Phipps aside, he spoke in urgent, hushed tones about the family's reputation, about the scandal that would surely follow, and about the need for discretion and expertise beyond what the local police could provide. "Send a telegram," he instructed his solicitor, "to that Belgian gentleman in Whitehaven Mansions, the one with the international reputation for solving impossible cases. If anyone can make sense of this madness, it will be him." Mr. Phipps nodded gravely, understanding perfectly whom his employer meant. In certain circles, the name was spoken with a mixture of awe and trepidation. A small, precise man whose little grey cells had illuminated the darkest corners of human deception and whose methods had never yet failed to reveal the truth, however carefully concealed. As the last of the wedding guests departed in confusion and dismay, leaving behind them a church that had been prepared for celebration but had witnessed only mystery, the stage was set for the arrival of the one man who might unravel the impossible disappearance of the bride who had vanished before her vows. The affair at St. Bartholomew's had begun, and with it, another chapter in the extraordinary career of Hercule Poirot. The fog that had begun to gather over London as the afternoon waned now drifted through Grosvenor Square like the breath of some melancholy spirit, lending an air of unreality to the events that had shattered the ordered world of the Ashworth family. The great townhouse, its Georgian facade normally a testament to prosperity and respectability, seemed to brood in the gathering dusk, its windows blazing with light as though the inhabitants were attempting to hold back the encroaching darkness through sheer force of illumination. Within the oak-panelled drawing room, the principal actors in the day's inexplicable drama had been assembled at Sir Edmund's urgent request and held there by the discreet but firm insistence of Scotland Yard. The room, which had witnessed countless social gatherings and business negotiations over the decades, now served as an impromptu court of inquiry where grief, bewilderment, and barely concealed suspicions mingled in an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusations. Lady Margaret Ashworth maintained her position in a high-backed chair with the rigid composure that had become her armor against a world that dared to challenge her authority. Her steel-gray hair remained perfectly arranged beneath her hat of midnight blue, and her pale eyes surveyed the assembled company with the calculating gaze of a general reviewing potentially mutinous troops. Yet those who knew her well might have detected the slight tremor in her gloved hands and the uncharacteristic tightness around her mouth that betrayed the strain beneath her iron self-discipline. Sir Edmund paced between the marble mantelpiece and the tall windows overlooking the square, his usual commanding presence diminished by circumstances beyond his control or comprehension. The textile magnate who had built an empire through shrewd negotiation and unwavering determination now seemed oddly fragile, his florid complexion ashen and his movements betraying a nervous energy that spoke of a man grappling with the impossible. Julian Ashworth had arranged himself with studied carelessness upon a low sofa, a crystal glass at his elbow and his evening clothes already showing the dishevelment that seemed to follow him like a shadow. His handsome face bore the pallor of too many late nights and too much champagne, but his dark eyes held a watchfulness that suggested he was far more alert to the undercurrents in the room than his languid pose might indicate. From time to time, his fingers drummed a restless tattoo against his glass, the only outward sign of the tension that coiled beneath his nonchalant exterior. Captain Reginald Pemberton stood near the window in his dress naval uniform, the gold braid on his shoulders catching the lamplight as he stared out at the darkening square. His weathered face, which had gazed across storm-tossed seas with unflinching resolve, now bore an expression of bewilderment that sat strangely upon his usually confident features. There was a faint red mark upon his right wrist, as though from a thorn or an impatient adjustment of his cufflinks, and he kept his hands resolutely still upon his sword belt, as if military discipline might somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly ceased to make sense. Miss Sylvia Carfax occupied a small chair near the fire, her wedding finery now seeming almost grotesque in the circumstances. She had removed her hat, and the firelight played over the pale crown of her fair hair, creating shadows that seemed to accentuate the hollows beneath her eyes. Her hands twisted a lace handkerchief with mechanical precision, and though her tears had dried, there was something in her expression, a watchfulness, a careful attention to every word spoken, that suggested she was as much observer as mourner. Mr. Bernard Phipps had positioned himself in a shadowed corner of the room, his thin frame draped in funeral black despite the day's intended celebration. His pale eyes, stripped of any pretense at sympathy, moved from face to face with the calculating precision of a man accustomed to weighing evidence and measuring motives. His long fingers were steepled before him, and he seemed to catalogue every gesture and expression with professional interest. The man seated at the writing desk, whose notebook had already filled several pages with careful observations, was Chief Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. He possessed the rugged countenance of one who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little, and his manner suggested both competence and a certain skepticism toward the more dramatic aspects of the case that had been thrust upon him. "Now then," Japp said, his voice carrying the patient authority of experience. "Let's go through this once more, shall we? Mr. Whitmore, you locked the vestry door at precisely what time?" The old sexton, who sat clutching his hat like a talisman, wheezed his response. 11:10 by the chancel clock, Inspector. Miss Honoria had asked for a few minutes of quiet before the ceremony. I locked it with my own key, same as I've done for 47 years. And who else has access to a key? Japp's pen hovered over his notebook. "Only the Reverend, sir, and there's one more kept in the vestry safe for emergencies." The Reverend Mr. Allardyce, whose mild face looked more distressed than his calling had prepared him to be, cleared his throat nervously. "My key is here," he said, producing it from his waistcoat pocket. "But the emergency key?" He hesitated, his color deepening. "I'm afraid it appears to be missing from the safe." A rustle of interest passed through the assembled company. Lady Margaret's head turned fractionally, her pale eyes fixing upon the clergyman with laser-like intensity. "When did you last see it?" Japp inquired, his pen moving across the page. "Last week, when the florist required access to measure the space for the pedestal arrangements. I opened the safe in his presence, though I certainly did not give him the key. I replaced it immediately." His voice faltered under the weight of implication. "I may have neglected to verify its presence since then. So someone with access to the vestry after last week could have obtained the spare key," Japp concluded matter-of-factly. "That makes our miracle somewhat less miraculous, doesn't it?" "It explains nothing of consequence," Sir Edmund interjected sharply. "It does not account for the dress, the shoes, the pearls, everything left behind as though she had simply evaporated." Japp turned a page in his notebook with deliberate precision. "About those items. The gown laid out just so, the shoes placed neatly beneath the bench, the family pearls coiled on the table, the bouquet arranged as pretty as a picture. In my experience, brides who choose to bolt don't usually take time to undress and arrange their belongings like a theatrical display." "My daughter," Lady Margaret observed, each syllable clipped as wire, "is not given to theatrical displays of any sort. She is a sensible girl who understands her obligations." "She was frightened," Miss Carfax said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. All heads turned toward her. "Not hysterical? No, Honoria is far too controlled for that, but frightened nonetheless. She spoke to me before she sent for Mr. Whitmore. She said she needed a few minutes to put her mind in order." Japp's pen paused above the paper. "Frightened of what, Miss Carfax?" There was a moment's hesitation before she replied. "Of the magnitude of the day, I suppose. Of the finality of it all." "Or of the man," Julian murmured from his corner, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach every ear in the room. Captain Pemberton's head snapped around with military precision, and he half rose from his position before subsiding again, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "If you mean to insinuate, I insinuate nothing, Captain," Julian replied with lazy insolence. "I merely observe that my dear sister's nerves have been rather delicate of late. One does wonder what might have caused such sensitivity." "That will be quite enough," Lady Margaret said, and though her voice remained level, it carried the unmistakable tone of absolute authority. Japp cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Phipps, perhaps you could enlighten us about the financial arrangements surrounding this marriage." The solicitor inclined his head with professional precision. "Certainly, Inspector. There is a marriage settlement, naturally. A trust established at Miss Honoria's birth stipulates that certain capital transfers will occur upon her marriage. Should the marriage take place, a substantial portion of the family wealth would leave direct Ashworth control to form the joint marital estate. If the marriage does not occur, the capital remains under Lady Ashworth's trusteeship until Miss Honoria reaches the age of 35. So we have money that moves or doesn't move depending on whether certain words are spoken or not," Japp observed, making a note. "In my experience, that sort of arrangement tends to give people powerful incentives." "Inspector," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying a chill that could have frozen the Thames, if you suppose that either Sir Edmund or I would countenance any action that might harm our daughter." "I suppose nothing, my lady," Japp replied with respectful firmness. "I simply count who benefits and who doesn't when circumstances change unexpectedly." Captain Pemberton's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The only person who benefits from this catastrophe is whoever took her away. If this is some elaborate scheme to extort money—" "From whom?" Julian laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your naval pension. Forgive me, Captain, but I know little of maritime ransoms. One hears more often of sailors being the ones abducted." Before the situation could deteriorate further, Reverend Allardyce spoke up with unexpected firmness. "There is something else, Inspector. Miss Honoria came to the church last evening. She wished to review the marriage ceremony, an unusual request from a bride, but she seemed most particular about the details. She appeared preoccupied and asked specifically about objections raised during the service." "Objections?" Japp's interest sharpened visibly. "She inquired," the vicar said miserably, "about what would happen if someone found themselves unable to speak the vows when the moment came." Captain Pemberton closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing a physical blow. Miss Carfax's fingers tightened on her handkerchief until her knuckles showed white. "And this morning," Japp continued methodically, "were there any messages? Visitors? Telephone calls?" Sir Edmund hesitated, his discomfort evident. "A telephone call came for Honoria at 9 o'clock. A woman's voice, though she refused to give her name. I sent the maid to fetch my daughter, and she took the call in the small morning room. She was longer than I should have liked." He swallowed hard. "When she emerged, she seemed pale but composed. When I inquired about the nature of the call, she said it was nothing at all." "Did anyone overhear the conversation?" Japp's eyes moved to Miss Carfax, who shook her head. "And immediately before the ceremony," Japp pressed on, "Miss Carfax, you mentioned adjusting the bride's veil. At what precise time?" "Just before 11 o'clock, she replied steadily. "I left her at perhaps 5 minutes past the hour." "Yet Mr. Whitmore locked the door at 10 minutes past, Japp observed, "and you didn't encounter him in the corridor." "I did not. I returned to the nave by the north aisle. I went round by the north door to reach the vestry," Whitmore added helpfully. "Different route entirely." Japp snapped his notebook shut with an air of professional satisfaction. "So we have a bride in a locked room, a missing spare key, more nervous tension than at a court-martial, and a mysterious telephone call from an unknown woman. Either Miss Ashworth left that room before it was locked, or she departed afterward by means we haven't yet discovered, quite possibly with the assistance of someone who possessed a key and had developed a taste for theatrical gestures." He rose from his chair, tucking the notebook into his coat pocket. "Don't mistake my meaning, ladies and gentlemen. The simplest explanation remains that Miss Ashworth chose to flee her wedding. Until I'm presented with evidence to the contrary, I shall proceed on that assumption." "Then you will most certainly be presented with such evidence," said a soft foreign voice from the doorway, a voice that carried an odd note of quiet certainty that seemed to fill the room despite its gentle tone. Every head turned toward the entrance, where a small, impeccably dressed gentleman stood silhouetted against the hallway light. The firelight caught the fine gloss of his patent leather shoes and the precise waxing of his magnificent mustaches. He bowed slightly to Lady Margaret with old-world courtesy, inclined his head respectfully to Sir Edmund, and allowed his remarkably green eyes to sweep the entire assembly in a single glance that somehow seemed to miss absolutely nothing. "Monsieur Poirot," Mr. Phipps murmured, rising from his chair with evident relief. "If you will permit me," said Hercule Poirot, entering the room as though he were arranging the very air around him to his satisfaction. "We shall have a little order here, yes? For the truth, she is a delicate creature who does not flourish amid noise and confusion." He adjusted a cushion on a nearby chair by an almost imperceptible margin, then placed his gloves upon the mantelpiece with mathematical precision. "We will not speak over much this evening," he continued, his accent lending a musical quality to his words. We will allow the dust of distress to settle, the emotions to find their proper level. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock precisely, I shall examine the scene of this mysterious disappearance. At 10 o'clock, I shall speak with each of you individually." He paused, and his extraordinarily keen gaze came to rest for just a moment upon a small smear of candle wax on the toe of Miss Carfax's shoe, a detail that had been noticed and immediately forgotten by everyone else in the room. "You must understand, my friends," he added with gentle authority, "it is not the doors and keys that interest Hercule Poirot most deeply. It is the hearts that lock themselves away and the secrets that slip through the cracks like smoke in the wind. Tomorrow we shall have the truth, and we shall have it arranged most tidily indeed." With that pronouncement, the great detective had arrived, and the real investigation was about to begin. The morning sun cast long, golden shafts through the stained-glass windows of St. Bartholomew's, transforming the ancient nave into a cathedral of colored light. Yet the beauty of the scene could not dispel the atmosphere of unease that seemed to cling to the very stones, as though the church itself remembered the mystery that had unfolded within its walls the previous day. Hercule Poirot stood in the center of the nave at precisely 9 o'clock. His small, immaculate figure a study in concentrated attention. His green eyes, remarkably keen and intelligent, swept the interior with the methodical precision of a master craftsman examining his tools. Chief Inspector Japp waited nearby, hands thrust deep in his overcoat pockets, his practical nature clearly at odds with what he perceived as unnecessary theatrical contemplation. "The scene, mon ami," Poirot murmured, his accented voice carrying easily in the hushed space. "She must be read like a book. But first, we must understand the library in which the book was written." He moved forward with small, precise steps, his patent leather shoes making no sound upon the ancient flagstones. "Tell me, what story does this arrangement tell us about yesterday's intended celebration?" Japp consulted his notebook with the weary efficiency of experience. "Standard wedding setup, as far as I can tell. Bride's family on the left, groom's on the right. Flowers arranged according to Lady Margaret's specifications. White roses and stephanotis cost a fortune according to the florist's invoice. And the seating, Japp, what does it reveal about the nature of this union?" "Well, the Ashworth side was packed. Family, business associates, half of Manchester society, I'd say. But Captain Pemberton's side—" Japp paused, considering. "Rather sparse, actually. Naval colleagues, a few distant relations. The man's something of a lone wolf, it seems." Poirot nodded approvingly, his attention now focused on the sight lines from various positions in the nave. "Precisely. And from the bride's perspective, processing from the vestry, what would she have seen? The eager faces of her family's social circle, the business connections that her marriage would cement, the weight of expectation made manifest in human form." He paused beside one of the ancient pillars, running his gloved hand along its carved surface. But also, perhaps, the realization that she was about to bind herself to a man whose life held few connections beyond duty and service. They proceeded to the vestry, that small chamber which had become the epicenter of an impossible mystery. In the clear morning light, the room seemed almost mundane, yet Poirot approached it with the reverence of a scholar entering a rare manuscript library. The wedding dress still lay upon the oak bench, its ivory silk and Belgian lace arranged with an almost ceremonial precision that spoke of careful hands and deliberate intent. Poirot did not immediately disturb the arrangement. Instead, he stood in the doorway, allowing his remarkable powers of observation to catalogue every detail. The morning light revealed subtleties that had been missed in yesterday's confusion, a faint dusting of powder upon the bench's surface, the slight displacement of a hairpin, the way the pearl necklace coiled with mathematical precision rather than the casual draping one might expect from a bride's hurried removal. "This arrangement, Japp," he said softly. "It troubles the logical mind. A woman in distress, a woman fleeing from unwanted obligation. Does she pause to fold her wedding gown with the care of a lady's maid? Does she arrange her pearls as though for a museum display? He knelt beside the bench with surprising grace, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. The floorboards beneath revealed their secrets to his trained eye. Tiny fragments of ivory silk thread caught upon a splinter in the ancient wood, a few grains of what appeared to be sugar scattered near the table leg, and, most intriguingly, several drops of hardened candle wax that had no business being in a room lit by electric fixtures. Someone brought a candle into this room, mon ami. But why, when there is adequate electric lighting? He carefully collected the thread fragments with a pair of tweezers, sealing them in a small envelope with methodical precision. And these threads, they are from the wedding dress, yes, but they are caught as though the fabric was handled with some urgency, some force. The window drew his particular attention. It was indeed far too narrow for any adult to pass through, and the dust upon its sill remained undisturbed. The lock showed no signs of tampering, and the view outside revealed only the sheer drop to the churchyard below. Yet Poirot examined it with the same meticulous care he had shown to every other detail, as though expecting the glass itself to whisper its secrets. "The physical impossibility, she remains intact," he murmured. "But impossibilities, in the experience of Hercule Poirot, are merely possibilities that have not yet revealed their true nature." The door to the vestry received equally thorough attention. The lock mechanism, while old, showed recent use. Tiny scratches in the metal that spoke of a key turned within the last day or two. More significantly, there was a faint smudge upon the brass plate at shoulder height, as though someone taller than the elderly sexton had braced themselves against the door. Their first interview was with Thomas Whitmore, the church sexton, whose 47 years of faithful service had ill-prepared him for the scrutiny of a detective investigation. He sat in the small church office, his weathered hands clutching his cap, his rheumy eyes reflecting the bewilderment of a man whose ordered world had suddenly ceased to make sense. "Now then, Monsieur Whitmore," Poirot began, his tone gentle but precise. "You have the kindness to tell me again about the locking of the vestry door. Every detail, if you please, no matter how small it may seem." "Well, sir," Whitmore wheezed, "it was just as I told the inspector yesterday. Miss Honoria asked for a few minutes of quiet before the ceremony. 'Give me a moment to compose myself, Thomas,' she said, gentle as always. So I locked the door at 10 minutes past 11, just as she requested. And you saw no one else enter or leave the vestry before this time?" "No one, sir. Not a soul. I went round by the north door to reach the vestry, you see. It's a bit of a detour, but it keeps me out of the way of the wedding guests. Don't like to intrude on such occasions." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes fixed upon the old man's face. "And in your many years of service, Monsieur Whitmore, have you ever had occasion to notice any irregularities about the vestry? Hidden spaces, perhaps? Old churches, they often contain surprises from earlier centuries." Whitmore's face brightened with the enthusiasm of a man discussing his life's work. "Oh, aye, sir. This old place is full of secrets. There's a priest hole in the south transept, and another behind the altar that dates back to Queen Elizabeth's time. The vestry, though—" He paused, considering. "Never found anything unusual there, sir. Just solid stone and good English oak. The Reverend Allardyce proved to be their next source of information, though his distress had, if anything, deepened overnight." The mild-faced clergyman sat across from Poirot in the parish office, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted the events leading up to the ceremony. "She came to see me the evening before the wedding," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Most unusual for a bride. But Miss Honoria seemed troubled. She asked very specific questions about the marriage ceremony." "What manner of questions, Monsieur le Curé?" "She wanted to know about objections. What would happen if someone found themselves unable to speak the vows when the moment came? She asked if such commitments were truly irrevocable, if there were any circumstances under which one might be released from such an oath." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally, And your response? I explained the sanctity of marriage vows, naturally, but I also mentioned that only death or formal annulment could dissolve such a bond in the eyes of the church. Allardyce's face crumpled with guilt. Perhaps I should not have spoken so definitively. The poor girl seemed to find my words rather overwhelming. And the missing emergency key, monsieur. You have no memory of its removal from the safe. The vicar's distress deepened. I've racked my brain, Monsieur Poirot. The last time I opened the safe was when Mr. Davison, the florist, required access to the vestry for his measurements. But I certainly didn't give him the key. I merely opened the safe to retrieve some old parish records he wished to consult for historical accuracy in his arrangements. Ah, this Monsieur Davison. He was present in the vestry when you opened the safe? Yes, but only briefly. He was more interested in the architectural details, the age of the stonework, the original layout. Quite the enthusiast for historical accuracy, actually. Said he wanted his floral arrangements to complement the medieval atmosphere. Poirot made a careful note in his small leather notebook. And this safe, it is well concealed? Behind a tapestry depicting St. Bartholomew. It's quite small, really. Just large enough for the emergency key and a few important documents. As they concluded their interviews and prepared to leave the church, Poirot paused once more in the vestry doorway. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the scene, and something in the altered illumination caught his attention. Upon the small table beneath the window, where the bride's bouquet had been found, there was the faintest circular mark. The ghost of a water ring, as though a glass had been placed there and removed. "Jap," he said quietly. "Someone took refreshment in this room yesterday morning. Tea, perhaps, or coffee. But the question that presents itself is this. Was it the bride seeking comfort before her ordeal? Or was it someone else entirely, someone who had reason to wait, to observe, to prepare?" He adjusted his hat with mathematical precision and stepped out into the nave, his mind already working to arrange the scattered pieces of information into a coherent pattern. The physical evidence spoke of careful preparation and deliberate arrangement. The interviews revealed a bride troubled by doubts and a missing key that could have provided access to the impossible room. But beneath these surface facts, Poirot sensed deeper currents of emotion and motive that would require all his psychological insight to navigate. "The little grey cells, mon ami," he murmured to Jap as they walked toward the church's main entrance. "They begin to perceive the outline of a most complex design. We have a bride who questioned the finality of marriage vows, a groom whose life held few connections beyond duty, a family whose wealth hung in the balance of spoken words, and somewhere in this arrangement, a person unknown who possessed both the means and the motive to transform a wedding day into a mystery." He paused at the threshold, turning back for one final look at the ancient church that had witnessed so many human dramas over the centuries. "Tomorrow, we shall speak with the remaining members of our caste. Each one, I suspect, holds a piece of the truth. And when all the pieces are properly arranged," he smiled, an expression of quiet confidence that spoke of absolute certainty in his methods. "When all the pieces are properly arranged, the picture will become clear, and justice will be served with the precision of a Swiss timepiece." The investigation was far from over, but Hercule Poirot had begun to glimpse the shape of the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of this most perplexing affair. At precisely 10 o'clock, Hercule Poirot had arranged himself in the Ashworth drawing-room with the meticulous care of a master craftsman preparing his workspace. He adjusted a curtain by half an inch to admit the optimal amount of morning light, positioned his chair at an angle that provided an unobstructed view of both the door and his subjects' faces, and placed his gloves upon the mahogany side table with mathematical precision. His small leather notebook lay open beside him, its pages ready to receive the delicate impressions of truth that he would carefully extract from each interview. Chief Inspector Jap occupied a chair near the window, his practical nature evident in the way he held his pencil poised over his official notebook. ready to record facts rather than the subtle psychological nuances that fascinated his Belgian colleague. The morning light revealed the determined set of his jaw and the patient skepticism that had served him well throughout his career at Scotland Yard. The first interview. Miss Sylvia Carfax. Miss Carfax entered the room with the careful composure of a woman who had spent sleepless hours rehearsing her responses to anticipated questions. She wore a morning dress of pale blue silk that complemented her fair complexion, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke eloquently of the night's troubled thoughts. Her hands, Poirot noted with professional interest, bore fresh scratches along the knuckles, tiny wounds that suggested recent contact with thorns or rough surfaces. "Mademoiselle Carfax," Poirot began, his tone gentle but precise, "you have been most patient during these trying circumstances. Perhaps you would be so kind as to tell me about your final conversation with Miss Honoria yesterday morning." She settled into the chair across from him, her fingers automatically seeking the comfort of her handkerchief. I helped her with the final adjustments to her veil just before 11 o'clock. She seemed thoughtful, but then brides often are at such moments. Thoughtful, yes. But you mentioned yesterday that she appeared frightened. This was not merely the natural nervousness of a bride. Miss Carfax's blue eyes darted toward the window before returning to meet Poirot's penetrating gaze. Honoria had been different these past few weeks, more introspective than usual, if such a thing were possible. She would sometimes stop mid-conversation, as though listening to something only she could hear. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes never leaving her face. And in that final conversation, did she speak of any specific concerns? The young woman's composure wavered for just an instant, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that spoke of carefully guarded secrets. She asked me a strange question. She wanted to know if I thought it possible to love someone deeply and yet be terrified of binding oneself to them forever. Most intriguing. And your response? I told her that such feelings were natural, that marriage was indeed a momentous step. But she shook her head and said it wasn't fear of marriage itself that troubled her. It was fear of what marriage might prevent her from doing. Miss Carfax's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then she said something that puzzled me greatly. She said, "There is someone, Sylvia. Someone who makes me feel truly alive for the first time in my life." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. She spoke of another gentleman? She never mentioned his name, but yes, someone she had met quite by chance, someone who understood her in a way that no one else did. She said he had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. "And these scratches upon your hands, mademoiselle, they are recent, are they not?" She glanced down at her knuckles with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Oh, these. I helped arrange the flowers yesterday morning. I arrived early at the church and noticed that one of the arrangements had become disheveled during transport. I took the liberty of making adjustments. The roses had particularly vicious thorns." "Ah, yes. The flowers. You encountered Monsieur Davison, the florist?" "Not directly. He had already departed when I arrived, but his work was somewhat careless. I simply wanted everything to be perfect for Honoria's day." The second interview. Captain Reginald Pemberton. Captain Pemberton entered with the measured tread of a man accustomed to command, though his weathered face showed the strain of uncertainty. An expression foreign to one who had navigated storm-tossed seas with unwavering confidence. He moved to salute out of habit before catching himself with a self-conscious adjustment of his uniform. "Captain," Poirot said, "you are prompt, a quality I admire greatly. Yesterday you searched the vestry with the thoroughness of an officer inspecting his ship, yet there is something you did not mention. There was correspondence, was there not?" Pemberton started visibly, his hand moving instinctively toward his breast pocket. "What makes you think that?" "The mark of fresh ink upon your right cuff last evening, and a telltale fold crease in your pocket that belonged not to your handkerchief, but to a letter carried close to the heart." Poirot spread his hands with gentle understanding. "We are among friends here, Captain. The naval officer's jaw worked for a moment before he reached into his pocket and produced a single sheet of paper, laying it upon the table between them with the reluctance of a man surrendering a treasured possession. The message was brief, printed in block capitals that spoke of deliberate disguise. Do not marry her, for your sake and for hers. You do not know what you are being asked to carry. It arrived 3 days ago, Pemberton said, his voice steady but strained. No signature, no return address. I considered it the work of some malicious gossip and chose to ignore it. But you kept it, Poirot observed gently, and you did not share it with Miss Honoria. I did not wish to alarm her with what I believed to be meaningless spite, though I confess. He paused, his weathered features reflecting an internal struggle. I confess that it planted seeds of doubt about matters I had previously considered resolved. What manner of matters, Captain? My past service, certain incidents that might be misconstrued by those unfamiliar with naval discipline and honor. There was an affair in Portsmouth involving a fellow officer who had made improper advances toward a lady under my protection. I challenged him to settle the matter as gentlemen should, and he withdrew rather than face the consequences of his behavior. And Miss Honoria learned of this incident? Julian Ashworth saw fit to inform her, though he presented the facts in a rather distorted light. When she questioned me directly, I explained the true circumstances, and she seemed satisfied with my explanation. Yet she continued to express reservations about the marriage. Captain Pemberton's composure wavered slightly. That morning telephone call troubled her greatly. A woman's voice, she said, though she refused to tell me the nature of the conversation. Afterward, she seemed transformed, not frightened exactly, but as though she had received news that changed everything. The third interview. Julian Ashworth. Julian Ashworth entered with his characteristic air of studied nonchalance, though Poirot's trained eye detected the subtle signs of a man who had spent the intervening hours in anxious contemplation rather than restful sleep. His morning suit was impeccably cut, but his pallor and the slight tremor in his hands suggested that brandy had been his primary companion through the dark hours. Monsieur Ashworth, Poirot began, yesterday you made certain observations about your sister's state of mind. Perhaps you would elaborate on these concerns. Julian arranged himself in his chair with theatrical precision, crossing one leg over the other and regarding Poirot with lazy insolence that seemed more performance than genuine attitude. My dear fellow, Honoria has always been the perfect daughter, dutiful, obedient, conscious of her obligations to the family name. But perfection can be a crushing burden, particularly when it's imposed rather than chosen. You suggest that she found her circumstances oppressive? I suggest that she may have discovered certain truths that gave her pause. Our family presents a very proper facade, Monsieur Poirot, but beneath the surface run currents of ambition and resentment that can be quite turbulent. And your own position in these family currents, Monsieur Ashworth? Julian's smile sharpened like a blade. I am what you might call financially dependent upon family goodwill. The marriage settlement would have affected the distribution of capital in ways that could prove inconvenient for someone in my position. Mother controls the purse strings with an iron grip, and my allowance is subject to her approval of my conduct. These financial pressures, might they have motivated someone to prevent the marriage? They might motivate any number of actions, Monsieur Poirot. Though I should point out that my sister's happiness was worth more to me than any monetary consideration. His dark eyes glittered with something that might have been genuine emotion. Honoria deserved better than a marriage of convenience, even one as respectable as Captain Pemberton could provide. The fourth interview, Lady Margaret Ashworth. Lady Margaret entered the room with the same regal bearing she had displayed throughout the crisis, her composure as unyielding as polished granite. She settled into the chair across from Poirot with the air of a monarch granting audience, her pale eyes surveying him with calculating assessment. Lady Margaret, Poirot began with a courteous bow, I understand that you are most enthusiastic about this marriage between your daughter and Captain Pemberton. "Naturally," she replied, her voice cool and measured. "It was an excellent match in every respect. Both families would have benefited substantially, and Honoria would have been well provided for. Captain Pemberton is a man of impeccable character and distinguished service record." And Miss Honoria herself, was she equally enthusiastic? Lady Margaret paused, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her pale eyes. "Honoria is a sensible girl who understands her obligations. Love, Monsieur Poirot, is often an ephemeral thing. Compatibility, stability, and shared social position provide far more enduring foundations for a successful marriage." "A most practical philosophy, madame. Yet I am told that Miss Honoria had been expressing certain reservations about the arrangement." "Young women often experience nervousness before such a significant step. It is perfectly natural and no cause for alarm. But the telephone call yesterday morning seemed to affect her quite profoundly. You observed her reaction, did you not?" Lady Margaret's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "She seemed agitated, yes, but she assured me it was nothing of consequence. Her exact words. I saw no reason to press the matter further." "And you have no suspicion as to the identity of the caller?" "None whatsoever. Honoria's circle of acquaintances is small and entirely respectable." As the interviews concluded, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him in an attitude of deep thought. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the room, and with each revelation, the mystery had grown more complex rather than clearer. "So, Jap," he said finally, his accent lending a musical quality to his words, "we have assembled quite a collection of secrets, have we not? A bride who spoke of someone who made her feel truly alive. A groom who received anonymous warnings. A brother whose financial future hung in the balance. And a mother whose control over family affairs was absolute." Jap consulted his notes with practical efficiency. "We've also got a mysterious telephone call from an unknown woman, a florist who carried carpenter's tools, and a missing emergency key that could have been copied in candle wax." "Précisément, mon ami, and each of these elements suggests not a spontaneous flight from unwanted obligation, but a carefully orchestrated plan involving multiple participants and considerable advance preparation." Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the ordered geometry of Grosvenor Square. The little grey cells, they begin to perceive a pattern of such complexity that one must admire the intelligence behind it, even as one prepares to expose its fatal flaw. For you see, Jap, the truth in this case is not hidden by the absence of evidence, but by an abundance of it, so much misdirection and careful arrangement that the real motive becomes obscured like a single star in a constellation of deception. He turned back to face his colleague, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a hunter who has caught the scent of his quarry. "Tomorrow we shall visit this Monsieur Davison, the florist with the carpenter's tools, and I suspect that when we do, the first threads of our carefully woven mystery will begin to unravel most dramatically indeed." The investigation was entering its crucial phase, and Hercule Poirot had never been more confident that the truth, however ingeniously concealed, would soon reveal itself in all its startling complexity. The narrow streets of Bloomsbury glistened with morning rain as Hercule Poirot and Chief Inspector Japp approached the establishment of Davison & Sons, floral artisans. The shop occupied a Georgian building that seemed to lean against its neighbors with the weary dignity of age, its brass nameplate bearing the patina of decades, while the lock beneath showed the bright scratches of recent replacement, a detail that did not escape Poirot's observant eye. The window display presented arrangements of autumnal splendor that spoke of considerable skill. Yet Poirot noted with professional interest that several specimens would have been prohibitively expensive for a modest neighborhood establishment. Rare orchids from the Orient nestled beside, hothouse roses that required substantial capital to maintain, suggesting that Mr. Davison's clientele extended well beyond the ordinary citizens of Bloomsbury. Within the shop, the air hung thick with the sweet, earthy perfume of damp soil and fresh-cut flowers. A young assistant with green-stained fingers looked up nervously as they entered, her eyes darting toward the rear of the establishment with unmistakable apprehension. "We are here to see Monsieur Davison," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had opened countless doors to truth. They found Arthur Davison in his workshop, a space that revealed far more about the man than his modest shop front had suggested. Among the expected implements of the florist's trade, pruning shears, wire cutters, and arrangement stands, were tools that belonged more properly in a carpenter's workshop. Fine chisels, a small hand drill, and most tellingly, a collection of brass keys in various stages of completion occupied a workbench with suspicious prominence. Davison himself proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, with the weathered hands of one who worked in soil and the sharp, intelligent eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating both botanical specimens and human nature with equal precision. His movements as he arranged a cascade of white orchids betrayed the delicate touch of an artist, yet there was something in his manner, a careful watchfulness that suggested depth beyond the arrangement of flowers. "Mr. Davison," Japp began with official courtesy, "Chief Inspector Japp, Scotland Yard, and this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. We're here about the Ashworth wedding." Davison straightened slowly, removing his spectacles to reveal eyes of a startling blue that seemed to take the measure of both men in a single glance. "Ah, yes, a regrettable business indeed. Such a shame. All those beautiful arrangements and no ceremony to grace them." His voice carried what appeared to be genuine disappointment, though Poirot detected an undercurrent of something more complex. "A great deal of work, all for naught." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, his gaze sweeping the workshop with methodical precision. "You have many talents, Monsieur Davison. Not merely with the delicate orchid, but also, it would seem, with the crafting of more durable objects." He gestured toward the carpentry tools with elegant discretion. A wry smile touched Davison's lips. "One must be versatile in this trade, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes a display requires a custom stand, or an antique arrangement needs historical accuracy in its mounting. I find working with wood rather therapeutic, a pleasant change from the ephemeral beauty of flowers." "Most interesting. Yesterday, at St. Bartholomew's, the Reverend Allardyce mentioned that you showed particular interest in the church's architectural details. You were present, I believe, when he opened the vestry safe?" Davison returned to his orchids, his movements becoming more deliberate. "Fascinating place, St. Bartholomew's. So much history in those ancient stones. I was making sketches for a new display concept, a medieval garden theme, you understand. The safe behind that tapestry of St. Bartholomew caught my attention, yes. Rather unusual placement for such a modern convenience in so ancient a setting. And the contents of this safe, did you observe them clearly?" The Reverend seemed somewhat flustered with the mechanism. "I recall seeing a small, rather old-fashioned key inside. The emergency key, I presumed. But I was more interested in the stonework itself." Poirot produced his small magnifying glass and moved to examine a workbench where several blocks of pale wax lay among the florist's supplies. One bore the unmistakable impression of a key, though the wards appeared too delicate for the medieval lock of St. Bartholomew's vestry. "You work with wax, Monsieur Davison?" "Certainly. We dip chrysanthemum stems in winter to prevent fraying, and sometimes take impressions for custom metal work." Davison's voice remained steady, though his hands had stilled among the orchid stems. "That particular impression is for my storage cupboard. The original key was wearing thin." "Ah, but of course." Poirot's tone remained conversational, yet something in his manner suggested he was far from satisfied with this explanation. "And yesterday morning, monsieur, you departed from St. Bartholomew's at what precise time?" "Shortly after 9 o'clock. My arrangements were complete, and I believe the family desired privacy for their final preparations. Yet Miss Carfax mentioned that your work required adjustment when she arrived. The roses, she said, had particularly troublesome thorns that left marks upon her hands. For the first time, Davison's composure showed signs of strain. His blue eyes sharpened with what might have been alarm, though he quickly masked it with professional concern. I cannot account for any deterioration in my arrangements after departure. Perhaps the transport was less gentle than one might have hoped. Japp stepped forward with characteristic directness. "Mr. Davison, we have reason to believe that someone with access to the vestry key assisted Miss Ashworth in her disappearance. Your presence in the church, your obvious skills with metalwork, and the timing of events all suggest—" "Suggest what, Inspector?" Davison's voice carried a note of challenge, though underneath lay something that might have been resignation. "That I am involved in some elaborate conspiracy? I am a florist, gentlemen. My concerns extend no further than the proper arrangement of God's botanical creations." Poirot moved closer, his green eyes fixed upon the florist's face with the intensity of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex mechanism. "But you knew Miss Honoria Ashworth beyond the mere professional relationship, did you not, monsieur? She came here not only to discuss floral arrangements, but to seek something else entirely, perhaps understanding, perhaps sympathy for her situation." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Davison's weathered hands trembled slightly as he set down his pruning shears, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that had been carefully suppressed until now. "She was a remarkable woman, Monsieur Poirot. Intelligent, sensitive, and profoundly unhappy. She came here initially to discuss the wedding arrangements, yes, but she returned several times afterward. She spoke of feeling trapped, of obligations that pressed upon her like a weight she could no longer bear. And you offered her counsel?" "I offered her friendship. Nothing more." Davison's eyes met Poirot's with defiant honesty. She deserved better than a marriage arranged for financial convenience, better than a life dictated entirely by others' expectations. "The telephone call, monsieur, the one that came from Miss Honoria yesterday morning. That was your voice, was it not?" Davison's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment he seemed to age before their eyes. "It was. I could not bear the thought of her going through with a ceremony that would bind her to a life of quiet desperation. I told her there might be another way. And this other way involved the spare key to the vestry, did it not?" The florist looked from Poirot to Japp, his expression a complex mixture of defiance and weary resignation. "I will not deny that I took an impression of that key when the opportunity presented itself. But what use was made of it, and by whom, I cannot say." Poirot nodded slowly, as though confirming a theory that had been forming in his mind throughout the interview. "You provided the means, Monsieur Davison, but not necessarily the execution. The arrangement of the wedding dress, the careful placement of the pearls and shoes. This speaks of a different hand, a different sensibility. Someone with intimate knowledge of Miss Ashworth's habits and preferences." As they prepared to leave the shop, Poirot paused beside a display of white roses that bore an uncanny resemblance to those that had adorned St. Bartholomew's the previous day. His trained eye detected that several stems showed the distinctive diagonal cuts of flowers that had been removed from larger arrangements and repurposed. "These roses, monsieur, they are from yesterday's wedding, are they not?" Davison's composure, already strained, showed further signs of cracking. "We retrieved them from the church after the—" Circumstances became clear. The Reverend gave permission rather than allow them to wilt uselessly. "And this retrieval took place when—" "Precisely." "Yesterday afternoon, after the police had completed their initial examination." As they walked away from the shop through the continuing drizzle, Japp shook his head with the bewilderment of a practical man confronted with increasingly complex circumstances. "So we have a florist who's also a locksmith, a romantic attachment that crosses social boundaries, and wedding flowers retrieved with suspicious promptness. What do you make of it all, Poirot?" "I make of it, mon ami, that we have identified one strand in a web of considerable complexity. Monsieur Davison provided assistance, yes, but he was not the architect of yesterday's elaborate performance. Poirot adjusted his gloves with characteristic precision as they walked. The little grey cells, they perceive that we are dealing with a conspiracy involving multiple participants, each contributing their particular skills to a carefully orchestrated deception. He paused at the corner, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a hunter who has caught the scent of his quarry. But most intriguing of all, Jap, is what Monsieur Davison did not tell us. His assistance was limited to providing access and perhaps emotional support, but the true mastermind of this disappearance remains hidden. Someone with intimate knowledge of Miss Ashworth's character. Someone who understood exactly how to stage a vanishing that would appear impossible while serving deeper purposes than mere romantic escape. The investigation had taken a crucial turn, revealing the first concrete evidence of conspiracy while simultaneously deepening the mystery. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, but already Hercule Poirot could sense that the resolution of this most perplexing case was drawing inexorably closer, and that the truth, when finally revealed, would prove far more complex than a simple tale of star-crossed lovers. The morning mist clung to the windows of the Ashworth townhouse like the breath of secrets reluctant to be spoken, lending an air of melancholy to what should have been the first day of a new bride's happiness. Instead, Hercule Poirot found himself arranging the pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle, each new revelation adding layers of deception rather than clarity to the mystery that had begun in the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's. With characteristic precision, Poirot had requested interviews with the household staff, understanding that servants often possessed the most intimate knowledge of a family's true circumstances. He received them in Sir Edmund's study rather than the grand drawing room, a deliberate choice that seemed to lower anxieties while maintaining his quiet authority. The testimony of the servants. Alice Green, Miss Honoria's lady's maid, proved to be a treasure trove of carefully observed details. A straightforward young woman with capable hands and an honest manner, she stood before Poirot with her work basket clutched like a shield. But her testimony was delivered with unwavering clarity. Miss Honoria was always particular about her things, sir, very tidy, very precise in her habits. But 3 days before the wedding, she had me let down the hem on her plain grey serge dress. When I mentioned there'd be no need for such alterations with her trousseau complete, she simply said it was important to have practical clothes available. Alice's brow furrowed with remembered concern. Then, yesterday morning, she specifically requested her dark blue walking coat, the one with the horn buttons. I laid it out on her bed as instructed. When we returned from the church, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. It was gone, sir. Gone without a trace. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. And you did not pack these items for the wedding journey? No valise prepared in advance? No, sir. The only luggage prepared was Miss Carfax's small case with emergency items for the bride. Smelling salts, powder, that sort of thing. Nothing of Miss Honoria's personal effects was sent ahead. The telephonist, an intelligent parlour maid temporarily assigned to the house's small switchboard, provided equally illuminating details about the mysterious morning call that had so disturbed the bride. The call came at precisely 9 o'clock, sir, from a public telephone box in the Bloomsbury district. The exchange operator mentioned the location because the connection was poor, most unusual for them to volunteer such information. Her voice carried the precision of someone trained to handle delicate communications. The caller asked for Miss Honoria by name, speaking very softly but with evident familiarity. She said it was urgent and concerned St. Bartholomew's. There was a pause, like she was steadying herself, before I connected the call to the morning room. Fresh evidence from the church. Chief Inspector Japp arrived with news that sent a thrill of satisfaction through Poirot's methodical mind. The second examination of St. Bartholomew's had yielded concrete evidence that transformed speculation into certainty. We found a candle stub in the north vestry waste bin, paraffin, not church stock, Japp reported with professional satisfaction. There's a clear lipstick smear on it. Rose pink, ordinary shop-bought variety. The wax drips you noticed on the vestry floor now make perfect sense. Someone used this candle to create a wax impression, and they weren't particularly careful about cleaning up afterward. More intriguingly, a bobby pin of expensive manufacture had been found adhered to one of the wax drips. Fine wire construction that spoke of quality and careful selection. Near the altar rails, they had discovered a single pearl with fresh scratches, clearly from the Ashworth family heirloom necklace. Most tellingly, a silver button of gentleman's waistcoat design had been found near the vestry door, well made but of common pattern. Physical evidence, mon ami, Poirot murmured with satisfaction. She does not lie as easily as human tongues. We have proof of premeditation, of careful preparation, and of multiple participants in yesterday's elaborate performance. The crucial interview with Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund Ashworth received them in his study with the dignity of a man who had built an empire but now found himself confronting forces beyond his control. His usually commanding presence seemed diminished by worry, and his thick fingers drummed an irregular rhythm against the mahogany desk's polished surface. "Monsieur Ashworth," Poirot began with gentle authority, "the time has come for complete honesty. Your daughter's disappearance was not spontaneous. It was carefully planned with assistance from multiple parties. What financial pressures might have motivated such elaborate deception?" Sir Edmund's composure cracked slightly, revealing the strain beneath his successful exterior. "There have been irregularities in our accounts recently. Nothing criminal, you understand, but Julian's debts have become far more substantial than I had disclosed to Lady Margaret. Gaming debts primarily, but also other expenses related to his social activities that have spiraled beyond reasonable bounds. And the marriage settlement would have provided the necessary liquidity? Precisely. The union would have consolidated certain business relationships while providing the capital necessary to address Julian's obligations without disturbing our primary investments." His voice carried a note of desperation that seemed foreign to his usual confident manner. But there were other factors that made this marriage particularly crucial. From his desk drawer, Sir Edmund produced a bundle of correspondence tied with black ribbon, letters that would prove to be among the most significant evidence in the entire investigation. These arrived over the past month, addressed to Honoria and claiming to be from a school friend in Edinburgh. But the postmarks were London, and the handwriting, while disguised, showed characteristics that troubled me greatly. Poirot examined the letters with his magnifying glass, immediately detecting the subtle consistencies that revealed a single author attempting to create multiple identities. The pressure of the pen, the slight tremor in certain strokes, and most significantly, the faint impression of other writing visible in the margins of the second letter. "Vestry Key," and "After the ceremony begins." "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. These documents reveal not merely emotional manipulation, but systematic planning involving intimate knowledge of your daughter's character and your family's circumstances. The author understood exactly how to appeal to Miss Honoria's deepest desires while undermining her confidence in her chosen path. Legal complications and financial motives. Mr. Bernard Phipps, the family solicitor, provided the final pieces of the financial puzzle with his characteristic precision. His pale eyes reflected professional caution as he outlined the complex legal arrangements surrounding the marriage settlement. The trust established at Miss Honoria's birth stipulates that substantial capital transfers would occur upon her marriage, he explained with meticulous care. Should the marriage not take place, the funds remain under Lady Margaret's trusteeship until Miss Honoria reaches 35. Should she be declared legally deceased or remain absent for 7 years, the trust would revert to the residual beneficiaries, primarily Sir Edmund and Lady Margaret, with a lesser portion to Mr. Julian Ashworth. So Miss Honoria's disappearance, while tragic, does not represent financial catastrophe for all family members. That is one interpretation of the legal facts, yes, Phipps conceded with professional neutrality. The psychological portrait emerges. As the interviews concluded, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him while the afternoon light shifted across the Persian carpet. The evidence had revealed a conspiracy of remarkable complexity, involving not merely romantic sentiment, but calculated manipulation of family dynamics and financial pressures. "So, Jap," he said finally, his accent lending musical quality to his observations, "we have assembled quite a collection of motives and methods. A bride who yearned for freedom but was bound by duty and financial obligation. A brother whose inheritance depended upon her marriage, but whose debts might be better served by her disappearance. A mother whose control over family finances was absolute, but whose authority was being questioned. And somewhere in this arrangement, a person unknown who possessed both the psychological insight to manipulate Miss Honoria's emotions and the practical skills to orchestrate her vanishing." Jap consulted his notebook with characteristic pragmatism. "We've got the missing clothes suggesting premeditation, the mysterious correspondence revealing systematic manipulation, the physical evidence proving multiple participants and financial motives that could justify elaborate deception. But who's the mastermind pulling all the strings? Ah, mon ami, that is the question that will unlock this entire affair." Poirot rose from his chair, adjusting his gloves with mathematical precision. "The little grey cells, they begin to perceive that we are dealing with someone who understands not merely the mechanics of deception, but the deeper currents of human psychology. Someone who could predict how each member of this family would react under pressure, someone who could orchestrate their responses like a conductor directing a complex symphony." He moved to the window, gazing out at the ordered geometry of Grosvenor Square while his mind arranged the scattered pieces of evidence into an increasingly coherent pattern. "Consider, Jap, the precision of yesterday's performance. The wedding dress arranged with ceremonial care, the pearls coiled with mathematical precision, the shoes placed with deliberate symbolism. This was not the work of a frightened bride fleeing unwanted obligation, but of someone who understood that the manner of disappearance would be as important as the disappearance itself. The investigation had reached a crucial turning point, revealing evidence of systematic manipulation, while raising disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of the missing bride. The physical evidence spoke of careful preparation, the financial arrangements provided multiple motives, and the psychological manipulation suggested a mind of considerable sophistication. "Tomorrow, mon ami," Poirot concluded with quiet confidence, "we shall examine the movements of our suspects in the hours immediately preceding the vanishing. For it is in the small details, the seemingly innocuous actions, that the truth often conceals itself most cunningly. The mastermind of this elaborate deception has been very clever, but no plan is perfect, and Hercule Poirot has never yet encountered a mystery that could not be solved through the proper application of method, psychology, and those invaluable little grey cells. The psychological game was intensifying, and the great detective was ready to sprint. The morning fog that had shrouded London since dawn began to lift as Chief Inspector Jap arrived at the Ashworth townhouse with the satisfied air of a man whose methodical police work had finally borne fruit. He spread his collection of evidence across Sir Edmund's mahogany desk with the precision of a prosecutor preparing his case. The candle stub with its telltale smear of rose-pink lipstick, the delicate bobby pin caught in hardened paraffin, and a telegram from the Bloomsbury telephone exchange confirming the morning call's origin. "Means motive and opportunity," Jap announced with professional satisfaction, ticking each element off with his pencil. Davison took the wax impression, made the telephone call that morning, and had the audacity to retrieve his flowers before the day was out. "I'll have my warrant within the hour." Hercule Poirot examined the candle stub with the careful attention of a scholar studying an ancient manuscript. "Oui, mon ami. It forms a most reasonable pattern. Yet patterns, they can sometimes deceive the eye. This evidence catches the obvious fish, but perhaps not the one that matters most. Japp's eyebrows climbed skeptically. What would you have me ignore, then? Nothing, mon cher Japp, but neither should we ignore what the evidence whispers between its louder proclamations. Poirot adjusted his gloves with mathematical precision. Permit me 1 hour before you make your arrest. There are threads here that require the most delicate handling. The return to St. Bartholomew's. Their second examination of the ancient church revealed details that had been obscured by yesterday's confusion and emotional turmoil. In the clear morning light, Poirot moved through the sacred space with the methodical precision of a master craftsman reading the story written in stone and shadow. Near the north porch, where the morning sun slanted through medieval glass, his gloved fingertip came away with the faintest trace of face powder, visible only because the light struck it at precisely the right angle. Between the threshold and the first paving stone, a minuscule grey fibre clung where any casual sweep would have missed it. Poirot lifted it delicately with a pin, examining it through his magnifying glass, before folding it carefully into a paper envelope. "Grey serge," he murmured with quiet satisfaction. Not silk, not Belgian lace, the practical fabric of a woman who values substance over ornament. Japp peered at the tiny evidence with growing interest. "You think the bride left in her everyday dress after all?" "I think, mon ami, that someone departed through this door wearing grey serge at a time when all attention was focused elsewhere, and if that someone was not the bride herself, then we have witnessed a performance of considerable skill." Old Thomas Whitmore, who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with guilt and confusion, shuffled forward with the hesitant air of a man carrying a burden too heavy for his aged shoulders. "Begging your pardon, sir," he wheezed, "but something came to me in the dark hours about the locking of the vestry door." "Speak freely, Monsieur Whitmore," Poirot encouraged with gentle authority. "Well, sir, Miss Honoria asked me at 11:05 to lock the door in 10 minutes' time. I went round by the north way. My old knees ached something fierce on the south stairs, and I'd left my spectacles by the organ console. When I reached the vestry door, I knocked as I always do, proper-like. A lady's voice answered, 'Yes, Thomas, be so good.' I turned the key without opening the door to look inside. Seemed the respectful thing to do." Whitmore's rheumy eyes reflected the weight of realization. "But, sir, I'm old, and my hearing isn't what it once was. In that dim corridor, with the voice muffled by the oak door, I took it for Miss Honoria's voice. But it could have been—" He trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "It could have been any woman who knew your habits and understood exactly what you expected to hear," Poirot completed gently. "You have nothing to reproach yourself for, mon ami. You did precisely as someone very clever arranged that you should do." The crucial interview, the afternoon interview with Miss Sylvia Carfax, took place in the small morning parlour of her modest lodgings, a space that reflected both refined taste and careful economy. She received them with the composed courtesy of a well-bred young woman, though Poirot's trained eye detected subtle signs of strain beneath her carefully maintained facade. The tea service was arranged with mathematical precision, each cup and saucer positioned with the attention to detail that spoke of a mind that found comfort in order. As Miss Carfax poured, Poirot noted that her rose-pink lipstick left the faintest impression on the delicate porcelain rim, a shade that seemed to glow with particular significance in the afternoon light. "You are most kind to receive us, mademoiselle," Poirot began with courtly courtesy. "The color you favor for your lips, it is most becoming. Rose pink suits your complexion admirably, though I observe it has a tendency to leave its signature on more than porcelain." Her hand stilled for the briefest moment in the act of pouring, then continued with practiced smoothness. "One must maintain some color on such dreary days, Monsieur Poirot." "Indeed. And the charming pin that holds your coiffure so elegantly. It appears to be of superior quality. One does not find such fine metalwork at every counter." She touched her hair with unconscious grace. "I purchased them at Fortnum's. They maintain their spring without bending. That is all one asks of a bobby pin." "And of a candle?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "One would not wish it to drip carelessly." Her blue eyes widened fractionally before she regained control. "I beg your pardon?" "In the vestry yesterday we discovered drops of paraffin upon the ancient stones, and upon your satin shoe that evening there remained a small but telltale smear of the same substance. Such details are trivial, perhaps, but trivialities often form the most revealing processions." Miss Carfax set down the teapot with deliberate care. "Are you suggesting that I brought a candle to the vestry?" "I suggest that you are a woman of considerable resource," Poirot replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of his words. "When flowers become disarranged, you restore them to their proper beauty. When a friend suffers distress, you offer comfort and counsel. And when a carefully laid plan begins to show signs of strain, you apply your delicate touch to ensure that the performance continues without visible flaw. Is that your assessment of my character, Monsieur Poirot? That I am merely a seamstress for other people's schemes?" There was steel beneath the silk of her voice now, a strength that had been carefully hidden until this moment. "I believe you are capable of loyalty that has been misdirected," Poirot said with gentle precision. Japp cleared his throat with the impatience of a man who preferred direct confrontation to psychological maneuvering. "Miss Carfax, did you assist in obtaining access to the vestry through the spare key?" "I did not take the key myself," she replied with careful accuracy. "Did you communicate with Mr. Davison on the morning of the wedding?" "Not directly." "No. Did you help Miss Ashworth change from her wedding dress into practical clothing?" "I helped her with many things over the years. We were the closest of friends." Poirot watched her responses with the attention of a conductor following a complex musical score, noting not merely the words but the pauses, the inflections, the careful precision of language that revealed as much as it concealed. The psychological pressure builds. "These letters," Poirot said, producing the bundle of correspondence that Sir Edmund had reluctantly provided, purporting to be from a school friend in Edinburgh, reveal a mind intimately acquainted with Miss Honoria's deepest fears and desires. The author understood exactly how to undermine her confidence while offering the promise of freedom from obligations that had become unbearable. He spread the letters upon the small table between them, their disguised handwriting a testament to careful deception. "But more than mere understanding, mademoiselle, these letters demonstrate the kind of knowledge that comes only from the most intimate friendship, the most trusted confidence." Miss Carfax's composure began to show hairline cracks, like fine porcelain under pressure. Honoria was desperately unhappy. Anyone who truly cared for her could see that she was being slowly crushed by expectations and obligations that left no room for her own desires. "So you sought to liberate her from these crushing obligations." "I sought to help a dear friend find the courage to choose her own path, rather than the one that had been chosen for her." Her voice carried a note of defiant pride now, as though she had moved beyond the need for concealment. "And this assistance involved careful preparation, did it not? The practical grey dress with its hem let down by an inch, the dark blue walking coat with horn buttons, the small valise packed with essentials for a journey, all arranged with the precision of a military campaign. She deserved better than a marriage arranged for financial convenience," Miss Carfax said, her blue eyes blazing with sudden passion. "She deserved the chance to discover what love could be when it was freely chosen rather than imposed by family obligation." The web begins to unravel. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes never leaving her face. But the execution required more than emotional support, did it not? It required someone with access to the church, someone who could prepare the vestry for the performance that would follow, someone who could ensure that old Thomas Whitmore heard exactly what he expected to hear when he knocked upon that oak door. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Miss Carfax's hands twisted her handkerchief with mechanical precision, but her eyes had taken on the desperate quality of a creature realizing that escape was no longer possible. "You were there that morning, mademoiselle," Poirot continued with inexorable logic. "Not merely to adjust floral arrangements, but to assist in the most delicate phase of the operation. You brought the candle because electric light would have been visible from outside. You helped arrange the wedding dress with ceremonial precision because the symbolism was important to the success of the deception. And when the moment came for the final act of this elaborate performance—" "She was terrified," Miss Carfax whispered, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling. Standing there in her practical clothes, ready to step into an uncertain future, she suddenly understood the magnitude of what she was abandoning. Not just an unwanted marriage, but her family, her position, everything she had been raised to value. And so she hesitated. She said she couldn't go through with it after all, that running away would solve nothing, that she would rather face an unhappy marriage than live with the guilt of abandoning everyone who depended upon her. Miss Carfax's voice carried the hollow tone of dreams turned to ashes. Poirot's expression softened with compassionate understanding. "But by then, mademoiselle, it was too late to simply abandon the plan. Too many people were involved, too many arrangements had been made. The performance had to continue, even if the leading lady could no longer play her part." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the modest parlor, Hercule Poirot recognized that he had uncovered not merely the mechanics of an elaborate deception, but the first threads of a tragedy that ran far deeper than anyone had yet imagined. Miss Carfax's involvement was clear, but the full scope of the conspiracy and the ultimate fate of Honoria Ashworth remained shrouded in shadows that would require all his psychological insight to illuminate. The psychological game had indeed begun, and the guilty party had been challenged indirectly, their reactions carefully observed and catalogued. But Poirot understood that this was merely the first movement in a complex symphony of deception, and the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. "Tomorrow, mademoiselle," he said as he prepared to take his leave, "we shall speak again, and perhaps by then you will find the courage to tell me what truly became of the friend you sought so desperately to save." The investigation had reached a crucial turning point, but the mystery of the vanished bride was far from solved. In the gathering dusk, Hercule Poirot contemplated the intricate web of loyalty, desperation, and carefully concealed truth that surrounded the disappearance of Honoria Ashworth, knowing that the most shocking revelations were yet to be unveiled. His trap. The grey October dawn brought with it news that would transform Hercule Poirot's methodical investigation into a race against time. Chief Inspector Japp arrived at Grosvenor Square with the grim efficiency of a man bearing unwelcome tidings, his weathered face reflecting the weight of developments that had unfolded in the dark hours of the night. "Poirot," he announced without preamble, "Miss Sylvia Carfax has vanished." The Belgian detective, who had been adjusting the precise angle of a photograph upon the mantelpiece, turned with the controlled grace that marked all his movements. His green eyes, usually bright with intellectual curiosity, now held a steely quality that spoke of deeper currents stirring beneath his composed exterior. Vanished, mon ami, or departed with assistance? Her landlady found the door unlocked this morning, bed unslept in, and signs of a hasty departure. But not the kind of haste that suggests panic, more like the kind that suggests persuasion. The evidence at Miss Carfax's lodgings. Their examination of the modest flat in Sloane Square revealed a scene that spoke eloquently of careful preparation, interrupted by unexpected developments. The small morning parlor retained the tidy calm of a room arranged by its occupant for departure, yet subtle details suggested a different conclusion to the evening's events than Miss Carfax had anticipated. The tea service had been washed save for one cup, its delicate porcelain rim bearing the faint impression of rose-pink lipstick that had become so significant to their investigation. Upon the mahogany table, a ghostly ring marked where the cup had rested, and beside it lay an open book, Romances of the Middle Ages, its pages uncut despite being open to a chapter on courtly devotion. She received a visitor, Poirot observed, his trained eye cataloguing details that others might have missed. Upon the windowsill, a single glove of pale lemon kid bore the faintest smear of dark substance, oil of a refined quality, the kind used for polishing brass fittings. The window latch itself showed microscopic traces of grey wool fibre, and upon closer examination with his magnifying glass, Poirot detected the ghostly residue of white chalk. "A gentleman caller," he murmured, "one who works with his hands despite his refined appearance. See here, Jap, the faint aroma of tobacco, not the common variety, but something more expensive. Balkan, perhaps, and this crescent mark upon the table beside the saucer, from a signet ring worn upon the little finger of the right hand." The evidence painted a picture of a visitor who had arrived with the specific purpose of persuading Miss Carfax to accompany him elsewhere. The washing of a single teacup suggested courtesy rather than panic, while the abandoned glove and uncut book pages spoke of departure under circumstances she had not anticipated. The break-in at St. Bartholomew's. Their investigation was interrupted by urgent summons to the vicarage, where they found Reverend Allardyce in a state of considerable distress. The study door stood ajar, revealing a scene of careful but thorough search. The tapestry of St. Bartholomew hung askew, its lower edge bearing a precise cut that spoke of someone seeking quick access to the wall safe behind it. "I went out at 9 to make parish calls," the vicar explained, his voice trembling with shock. "When I returned, I found this." He gestured toward a note placed prominently upon his desk, weighted down with a brass paperweight. The message, written in calm, controlled handwriting, contained only 4 words: "Let the dead rest." The safe itself told a more complex story. The emergency key had been returned, placed with almost ceremonial precision in its proper position, but other items were conspicuously absent. "What else did you keep here?" Japp inquired with professional directness. "Fragments of correspondence that the sexton retrieved from the vestry waste bin after your examination yesterday," Allardyce replied miserably. "Torn pieces of a letter with one legible phrase, 'After the ceremony begins.' I thought they might prove important to your investigation. And there was a small booklet, telephone numbers that Miss Honoria had left with me, asking me to pray for certain souls whose paths had crossed hers." Poirot examined the damaged tapestry with the careful attention of a scholar studying an illuminated manuscript. Upon the windowsill, almost invisible against the white paint, he discovered a faint smudge that his trained nose identified as boat tar, the same distinctive odor that had marked the evidence at Miss Carfax's lodgings. "Someone seeks to close the book on this investigation," he observed quietly. "They return what is expected while removing what might prove inconvenient, but in their haste to appear pious, they have left traces that speak more eloquently than any sermon." The crucial discovery. It was young Timothy Fletcher, a choir boy whose duties included tidying the church after practice, who provided the revelation that would transform their understanding of the entire case. The boy approached them with the hesitant manner of youth uncertain whether his discovery merited adult attention, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper torn from a church hymnal. "Found it tucked behind a prayer book in the north transept, sir," he explained to Poirot. "Thought it might be important, what with all the excitement about the missing lady." The note, written in Honoria Ashworth's unmistakable hand, though hurried and uneven as if composed under considerable emotional stress, contained words that struck like lightning through the carefully constructed theories they had been building. "Sylvia, I cannot. It is too much. I must stay. Forgive me. I pray you understand. I will explain everything later. H." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of realization. Japp was the first to speak, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man whose fundamental assumptions had just been shattered. She changed her mind. At the last moment, she decided not to go through with the escape. Précisément, mon ami. Poirot's accent became more pronounced as his excitement grew. Miss Honoria Ashworth, faced with the magnitude of abandoning everything she had been raised to value, chose the path of duty despite her profound unhappiness. She chose to remain and face her marriage, whatever the personal cost. The case transformed. The implications of this discovery rippled through every aspect of their investigation like stones cast into still water. If Honoria had decided to remain in the vestry, then her subsequent disappearance could no longer be explained as voluntary flight. The carefully staged scene, the wedding dress arranged with ceremonial precision, the pearls coiled with mathematical accuracy, the shoes placed with deliberate symbolism, took on an entirely different significance. The elaborate staging was not the work of a desperate bride, Poirot continued, his green eyes blazing with the intensity of revelation. It was a performance, orchestrated by someone who understood that if Miss Ashworth did not vanish voluntarily, then a more permanent solution would be required. The physical evidence they had so carefully catalogued now told a different story entirely. The bobby pin of superior quality, the rose-pink lipstick, the grey serge fibre, these were not the accoutrements of Honoria Ashworth's escape, but the props used by someone else in an elaborate impersonation. Miss Carfax, Japp breathed, understanding dawning in his practical mind. She had prepared the practical clothes. She was present in the vestry. She had the opportunity to stage the scene after Honoria changed her mind. But why continue with the deception once her friend had decided to stay? Poirot mused, though his tone suggested he was already formulating theories. Unless the plan had progressed too far to be abandoned. Unless there were other interests at stake that could not accommodate Miss Honoria's change of heart. The psychological game intensifies. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's, Poirot contemplated the transformation of their investigation from a case of romantic flight to something far more sinister. The evidence suggested not merely deception, but a conspiracy that had adapted to changing circumstances with terrifying efficiency. "Consider, Japp, the psychology of the situation," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a professor addressing a particularly complex theorem. Miss Carfax believed she was helping her dearest friend escape an unbearable situation. When that friend chose duty over freedom, what would a loyal but misguided woman do? Would she abandon the elaborate plan that had been set in motion? Or would she continue the performance, believing that she knew better than Honoria herself what was best for her future? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. If Miss Carfax had indeed impersonated the vanishing bride, then Honoria Ashworth's fate remained unknown. The transformation of the case from disappearance to potential abduction, or worse, cast every previous assumption in a new and frightening light. "We must find Miss Ashworth," Poirot declared with quiet urgency, "and we must find her quickly. For if she did not leave that church willingly, then she is in grave danger. The person who ensured her vanishing is still at large, a master of psychological manipulation whose true motives remain hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception." As they prepared to leave the church, Poirot paused once more in the vestry doorway, his remarkable mind working to reconstruct the events of that fateful morning. The empty room, once a symbol of a bride's flight, now seemed to whisper of darker possibilities, of a young woman who had chosen duty over desire, only to find that her choice had been anticipated and countered by forces more ruthless than she could have imagined. "The little grey cells, mon ami," he murmured to Japp as they walked toward the entrance. "They perceive that we have been investigating not a romance, but a tragedy, and tragedies, as the ancients knew well, often end not with escape, but with sacrifice." The psychological game had indeed taken a terrifying turn, and Hercule Poirot understood that the next revelation would determine whether their investigation concluded with justice served or with a young woman's life lost to the machinations of those who valued financial security above human happiness. The race against time had begun in earnest, and the stakes had never been higher. The crisp October morning brought with it developments that would test even Hercule Poirot's considerable powers of deduction. As the fog lifted from London's ancient streets, it seemed to carry away the last vestiges of simple explanation, revealing a mystery of such calculated complexity that the Belgian detective found himself both impressed and deeply disturbed by the intelligence behind it. The fire in Bloomsbury. Chief Inspector Japp arrived at Grosvenor Square with the grim efficiency of a man bearing news that would transform their investigation from missing person to potential murder. His weathered face reflected the weight of overnight developments that had unfolded in the narrow streets of Bloomsbury. "Poirot," he announced without preamble. "There's been a fire at Davison & Sons. Arthur Davison is dead." The scene that greeted them in the florist's workshop spoke eloquently of violence masquerading as accident. The fire had been carefully contained to the rear workroom, where wood shavings and preserving spirits provided ready fuel for flames that had burned with suspicious selectivity. Arthur Davison lay beneath a fallen shelf, his weathered face bearing an expression of surprised recognition rather than the terror one might expect from a man trapped by advancing flames. Poirot moved through the charred space with his characteristic precision, his patent leather shoes making no sound upon the water-soaked floorboards. The fire officer's assessment had been professionally blunt. The blow to the back of Davison's head had preceded the flames by several minutes, and the pattern of spirit spillage suggested deliberate rather than accidental ignition. "Regardez, Japp," Poirot murmured, his gloved finger tracing the edge of an overturned spirit lamp. "The lamp lies here, but the pool of accelerant begins there, beneath the shelf." Someone poured, then struck. This was not the work of panic, but of careful planning. Among the ashes, his trained eye detected details that spoke of the killer's identity and methods. A fragment of expensive tobacco ash. Balkan mixture, not the common Virginia that most men favored. A small coil of rope bearing the precise knots of someone trained in maritime disciplines. Most tellingly, a partially burned envelope corner bearing the impressed crest of Ashworth and Ashworth, suggesting correspondence that someone had deemed too dangerous to survive. In Davison's waistcoat pocket, protected by the man's body from the worst of the flames, they discovered a telegram that transformed their understanding of the conspiracy's scope. "North Stairs, 10 past. Wear the blue." The same precise timing as the vestry locking, Japp observed with professional satisfaction. And wear the blue. That must be Miss Carfax's walking coat. So Davison was receiving instructions, not merely providing assistance. The evidence multiplies. Their examination of the ruins revealed a workshop that had served purposes far beyond floral arrangement. Among the legitimate tools of the florist's trade, they found implements that belonged more properly in a locksmith's establishment. Fine files, brass blanks, and most significantly, several blocks of modeling wax bearing the clear impressions of keys in various stages of completion. Monsieur Davison was a man of many talents, Poirot observed, carefully collecting the wax impressions with his tweezers. But someone has ensured that these talents will no longer be available to complicate our investigation. A thorough search of the premises yielded additional evidence that painted a picture of systematic preparation spanning several weeks. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they discovered a collection of correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy surrounding Honoria Ashworth's disappearance. The letters, written in various hands but bearing subtle similarities that suggested a single author attempting to create multiple identities, outlined a plan of breathtaking audacity. Financial documents showed payments to private investigators, legal consultants, and, most disturbingly, to a private sanatorium in Surrey that specialized in the discreet treatment of nervous conditions in persons of quality. The revelation of deeper motives. The discovery of these documents sent Poirot's mind racing along new pathways of possibility. If the conspiracy involved not merely romantic manipulation, but systematic fraud designed to separate Honoria from her inheritance, then the stakes were far higher than anyone had previously imagined. "Consider, Jap," he said as they walked through the smoke-stained streets of Bloomsbury, "the psychology of someone who could orchestrate such elaborate deception. This is not the work of a misguided friend seeking to liberate a companion from unwanted obligation. This is the calculated manipulation of human emotion for financial gain." The evidence suggested a conspiracy involving multiple participants, each contributing their particular skills to a carefully orchestrated performance. Davison had provided the technical expertise, key duplication, document forgery, and the practical arrangements necessary for a convincing disappearance. Miss Carfax had supplied intimate knowledge of Honoria's character and habits, along with the emotional manipulation necessary to undermine her confidence. But behind these obvious participants, Poirot sensed the presence of a master manipulator whose identity remained carefully concealed. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Ashworth family's financial circumstances, someone who understood the legal implications of various courses of action, and someone who possessed the ruthless determination to eliminate obstacles as they arose. The missing pieces. Their investigation was interrupted by urgent summons from the Thames police, who had recovered a leather valise from the river near London Bridge. The case, when opened under Poirot's methodical supervision, revealed contents that seemed almost too convenient in their implications. The grey serge dress with its recently altered hem, the dark blue walking coat with distinctive horn buttons, and most significantly, an unused railway ticket to Edinburgh, dated for the morning after the wedding, all wrapped in oiled silk as though someone had taken great care to ensure their survival in the Thames's murky embrace. "Someone wishes us to believe that Miss Ashworth's escape ended tragically in the river," Poirot observed, examining the valise's interior with his magnifying glass. "But observe, mon ami, the water damage is superficial. The interior remains remarkably dry for a case that supposedly carried a desperate woman's possessions to their watery grave." The discovery of the valise raised disturbing questions about Honoria's ultimate fate. If the evidence of her intended escape had been deliberately planted in the Thames, then what had become of the young woman who had chosen duty over desire in those final moments before her wedding ceremony? Thrald. Psychological pressure builds. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across London, Poirot contemplated the intricate web of deception that surrounded the Ashworth family. The physical evidence pointed toward a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, involving not merely the staging of a disappearance, but the systematic manipulation of legal and financial systems for criminal gain. "The little grey cells, they begin to perceive the true scope of this affair," he murmured to Jap as they prepared to return to Grosvenor Square. "We are not investigating a simple case of romantic flight, nor even a tragic accident. We are confronting a criminal enterprise that has used the deepest human emotions, love, loyalty, family obligation, as tools in a scheme of breathtaking audacity." The evidence suggested that Honoria Ashworth had been caught between competing forces, each seeking to control her choices for their own purposes. Her family demanded that she honor her engagement to secure their financial stability. Miss Carfax urged her to flee toward an uncertain but authentic future, and somewhere in this arrangement, a third party had been manipulating both sides toward an outcome that served neither Honoria's happiness nor her family's legitimate interests. The race against time. As evening approached, Poirot understood that their investigation had reached a critical juncture. The murder of Arthur Davison demonstrated that the conspiracy's architects were prepared to eliminate anyone who might expose their activities. Miss Carfax's disappearance suggested that she too had become a liability rather than an asset to the scheme. Most urgently, the question of Honoria Ashworth's whereabouts remained unanswered. If she had not fled willingly, if she had not perished in the Thames, then she remained somewhere in the power of those who had orchestrated her disappearance. The legal documents discovered in Davison's workshop suggested that her confinement might be taking place under the guise of medical treatment, making rescue both urgent and complex. "Tomorrow, mon ami," Poirot declared with quiet determination, "we shall assemble our remaining suspects for the final act of this elaborate performance. The psychological game has been played with considerable skill, but every player has revealed something of their true nature through their actions. The time has come to arrange these revelations in their proper order and expose the truth that lies beneath so many layers of carefully constructed deception." The investigation had transformed from a case of missing bride to potential murder and fraud, yet Hercule Poirot remained confident that his methods would ultimately prevail. The evidence was complex, the motives were layered, but human nature remained consistent in its fundamental patterns. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy for financial gain, and that someone would soon face the inexorable logic of the great detective's little gray cells. The psychological game was approaching its climax, and justice would soon be served with the precision that had made Hercule Poirot's reputation legendary throughout the civilized world. The drawing room of the Ashworth townhouse had been transformed into a court of final judgment, its Georgian elegance providing a fitting backdrop for the climactic revelation of a conspiracy that had challenged the very foundations of logical thought. Hercule Poirot had arranged the furniture with his characteristic precision, ensuring that each participant would face the inexorable light of truth without possibility of escape. The assembled company represented every thread in the web of deception that had ensnared the Ashworth family. Sir Edmund sat with the rigid composure of a man whose empire had been built on careful calculation, though his thick fingers betrayed his anxiety through their restless drumming against the mahogany armrest. Lady Margaret occupied her customary position with regal bearing, her pale eyes surveying the gathering with the calculating assessment of a general reviewing potentially treacherous terrain. Julian Ashworth had arranged himself with studied nonchalance upon the low sofa, though his pallor and the faint tremor in his hands suggested that the weight of recent events had finally penetrated his carefully maintained facade of indifference. Captain Pemberton stood near the tall windows in his dress naval uniform, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had navigated storm-tossed seas but found himself adrift in circumstances that challenged his understanding of human nature. Mr. Bernard Phipps occupied his customary shadowed corner, his thin frame draped in funeral black, his pale eyes moving from face to face with the calculating precision that had served him so well throughout his legal career. Chief Inspector Japp sat with his notebook ready, though his expression suggested he expected more revelation than mere documentation from the proceedings about to unfold. The methodical revelation begins. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "we have assembled to discuss not merely the disappearance of a bride, but the unraveling of a conspiracy so elaborate in its conception and ruthless in its execution that it challenges our understanding of human nature itself." He moved to the mantelpiece with his characteristic precision, adjusting a photograph by an imperceptible margin before continuing. "For too long, we have been misdirected by the assumption that Miss Honoria Ashworth fled her wedding of her own free will. This assumption, carefully cultivated by the true architect of these events, has obscured the terrible reality that lies beneath." The Belgian detective produced the crumpled note that had been discovered in the north transept, holding it aloft like a sacred relic. This message, written in Miss Honoria's own hand, though hurried and uneven with emotional distress, transforms our entire understanding of the case. "Sylvia, I cannot. It is too much. I must stay. Forgive me. I will explain everything later." A gasp escaped Lady Margaret's lips, while Captain Pemberton's rigid military posture slackened with a mixture of relief and profound regret. The implications rippled through the assembled company like stones cast into still water. You see, Miss Honoria Ashworth did not flee her obligations. Poirot continued with inexorable logic. In those final moments in the vestry, faced with the magnitude of abandoning everything she had been raised to value, she chose the path of duty despite her profound unhappiness. She chose family loyalty over personal freedom, responsibility over romantic escape. The web of deception exposed. But if Miss Honoria chose to remain, Poirot observed, his green eyes moving methodically from face to face, then her subsequent disappearance cannot be explained as voluntary flight. Someone could not permit her change of heart. Someone had invested too much in her vanishing to allow her return to duty and obligation. He began to pace with measured steps, his patent leather shoes making no sound upon the Persian carpet. Let us examine the evidence that has accumulated through our investigation, piece by carefully concealed piece. Poirot produced his collection of physical evidence with the precision of a master craftsman displaying his tools. The candle stub discovered in the vestry waste bin, bearing the distinctive rose-pink lipstick that we have traced to Miss Sylvia Carfax. The bobby pin of superior quality, caught in hardened paraffin and matching those purchased at Fortnum's by the same young lady. These items tell us that Miss Carfax was indeed present in the vestry with a candle, not for illumination, but for the creation of a wax impression. The grey serge fibre found at the north porch, matching the practical dress whose hem had been recently altered by Miss Honoria's lady's maid, the faint trace of face powder visible only in precisely angled morning light. These details confirm that someone departed through that door, wearing Miss Honoria's everyday clothing, while all attention was focused elsewhere. Sir Edmund leaned forward with growing alarm. "You're suggesting that Miss Carfax impersonated our daughter?" "Précisément, Monsieur Ashworth. Miss Carfax, motivated by misguided loyalty to her dearest friend, completed the vanishing act that had been so carefully prepared. She walked from that church in the grey serge dress, believing she was securing Honoria's freedom from an unbearable situation." The psychological manipulation revealed. Poirot's voice took on a darker tone as he addressed the deeper currents of the conspiracy. But Miss Carfax was not the architect of this elaborate deception. She was merely another victim of psychological manipulation by someone far more calculating and ruthless. He produced the bundle of correspondence that had so troubled Sir Edmund. These letters, purporting to be from a school friend in Edinburgh, were designed with surgical precision to undermine Miss Honoria's resolve. They demonstrated an intimate understanding of her character, her fears, her yearning for an authentic life beyond the constraints of family obligation. The handwriting, though cleverly disguised, revealed subtle consistencies that speak of a single author creating multiple identities. The pressure of the pen, the slight tremor in certain strokes, the faint impressions of other writing visible in the margins, all these details point to someone skilled in legal documentation and accustomed to manipulating written evidence. Poirot's gaze came to rest upon the thin figure in the shadowed corner. Someone with unlimited access to family correspondence, financial records, and the most intimate details of the Ashworth family's private affairs. The financial motive exposed. The marriage settlement, Poirot continued with relentless logic, provided the key to understanding the true scope of this conspiracy. As Mr. Phipps so meticulously explained to us, substantial capital transfers would occur upon Miss Honoria's marriage. If the marriage did not take place, the funds would remain under Lady Margaret's trusteeship until Miss Honoria reached 35. He paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust in sunlight. But if Miss Honoria were to be declared legally deceased or remain absent for 7 years, the trust would revert to the residual beneficiaries. During that time, the family's legal affairs would continue to be managed by their trusted solicitor, collecting substantial fees while gradually transferring assets to accounts under his control. Mr. Phipps remained motionless in his chair, though his pale eyes had taken on the watchful quality of a cornered animal calculating its chances of escape. The evidence converges. The physical evidence speaks with increasing clarity, Poirot declared, producing the fragments they had discovered throughout their investigation. The Balkan tobacco ash, found at both Davison's workshop and Miss Carfax's lodgings, an expensive mixture not commonly available, requiring special ordering from suppliers who serve a discriminating clientele. The precisely knotted maritime rope discovered at the scene of Monsieur Davison's murder, displaying the expertise of someone trained in naval disciplines during their youth. The chalk dust found at multiple locations, bearing the distinctive composition used for marking legal documents and architectural drawings. Most significantly, the signet ring impression discovered on Miss Carfax's table, a mark left by someone who had pressed too hard while leaning forward in urgent conversation, betraying the habitual impatience of a man accustomed to controlling every detail of complex negotiations. Poirot's voice grew cold as he addressed the room's occupants. Arthur Davison was murdered because he had become a liability rather than an asset. His romantic attachment to Miss Honoria had made him useful for the initial phases of the conspiracy, but his knowledge of the true scope of the plan made him dangerous once the scheme began to unravel. The final accusation. The mastermind of this elaborate conspiracy possessed not merely technical skills and financial knowledge, but the psychological insight necessary to manipulate each participant according to their deepest motivations, Poirot declared with quiet authority. Miss Carfax's loyalty was exploited through her genuine concern for her friend's happiness. Monsieur Davison's cooperation was secured through his romantic feelings and his desire to help someone he believed was suffering. But this person also possessed the ruthless determination to eliminate obstacles as they arose. When Davison became a threat, he was murdered with calculated efficiency. When Miss Carfax began to understand the true nature of the conspiracy, she was abducted and confined under false medical pretenses. Poirot's remarkable green eyes fixed upon the solicitor with laser-like intensity. Monsieur Bernard Phipps, you have served this family with apparent loyalty for many years, but your true loyalty has been to your own financial security. You orchestrated this entire conspiracy to secure control over the Ashworth fortune, while eliminating the one person who could expose your systematic embezzlement of family funds. The confession and resolution. The silence that followed was broken only by the measured ticking of the grandfather clock. Phipps remained motionless for a long moment, then slowly rose from his chair with the dignity of a man who had always understood that his elaborate scheme contained the seeds of its own destruction. Your psychological insight is remarkable, Monsieur Poirot, he said with quiet resignation. I'd hoped that the complexity of the arrangement would provide sufficient misdirection, but I underestimated your ability to perceive the patterns beneath the surface chaos. Chief Inspector Japp moved forward with professional efficiency, his handcuffs ready. Bernard Phipps, I arrest you for the murder of Arthur Davison and the abduction of Miss Honoria Ashworth and Miss Sylvia Carfax. They are both alive, Phipps said as the metal clicked into place around his wrists. Confined at Millbrook Sanatorium in Surrey under false identities but unharmed. I'm not a murderer by inclination, merely a man who saw an opportunity to secure his retirement through careful planning rather than violent action. The philosophical conclusion. As the solicitor was led away through the gathering dusk, Hercule Poirot stood in contemplative silence, his mind already turning from the mechanics of crime to the deeper questions of human nature that such cases inevitably raised. The little grey cells, mon ami, he murmured to Japp as they prepared to coordinate the rescue of the two young women. They perceive that the most dangerous criminals are often those who commit their crimes from behind desks rather than in dark alleys. Monsieur Phipps orchestrated a conspiracy that exploited the deepest human emotions, love, loyalty, family obligation, as tools in a scheme of breathtaking audacity. He understood that people could be manipulated not through fear or violence, but through their own noble impulses turned against them. Miss Carfax's devotion to her friend, Monsieur Davison's romantic attachment, even Miss Honoria's sense of duty, all were weapons in the hands of someone who valued financial security above human happiness. The affair at St. Bartholomew's had reached its conclusion, but its lessons about the complexity of human nature and the dangers of unchecked ambition would linger long after the last echo of those ancient bells had faded into memory. Justice had been served with a precision that had made Hercule Poirot's reputation legendary throughout the civilized world, and two innocent young women would soon be restored to freedom and the possibility of choosing their own paths forward. The psychological game had been played to its bitter end, and once again, the methodical application of logic and psychological insight had triumphed over even thee. The Surrey countryside lay shrouded in morning mist as Hercule Poirot and Chief Inspector Japp approached Millbrook Sanatorium through gates that had concealed suffering behind their respectable facade. The private institution, nestled among ancient oaks and carefully manicured lawns, presented the deceptive appearance of a country estate. Yet Poirot's trained eye detected the subtle modifications that transformed elegance into confinement. Discreet bars behind leaded windows, groundskeepers whose bearing suggested security rather than horticulture. Dr. Reginald Thornfield, the sanatorium's director, received them in his oak-paneled office with the nervous courtesy of a man whose profitable arrangements had suddenly become legally precarious. His pale eyes darted repeatedly toward the telephone as though expecting communication that might yet salvage his position. "The patients you inquire about were admitted under the names Miss Sarah Hartwell and Miss Catherine Pembroke," he explained with careful precision. "Their guardian, Mr. Phipps, provided all necessary documentation and paid the fees in advance, explaining they suffered from acute nervous exhaustion following a family tragedy." Poirot examined the admission papers with his magnifying glass, revealing subtle inconsistencies that spoke of hasty forgery. The signatures showed telltale hesitations of someone copying, unfamiliar handwriting, while the medical assessments described symptoms designed to justify indefinite confinement rather than active treatment. The rescue and revelations. The private wing where the two women had been confined occupied the sanatorium's eastern section, its windows offering views of gardens that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Miss Sylvia Carfax was discovered first, in a room made genteel by chintz and carefully arranged flowers, a mockery of comfort that could not disguise the locked door and barred windows. She rose from her chair with the dignity of someone who had maintained her composure through circumstances that might have shattered a weaker spirit. Though pale from her ordeal, her blue eyes blazed with controlled fury as she recognized her rescuers. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with quiet intensity, "I've been the greatest fool in London. My desire to help Honoria escape what I believed was an unbearable situation led me to become an instrument of the very forces that sought to destroy her." Miss Honoria Ashworth appeared in the doorway of the adjoining room, her composed bearing intact despite the strain of her confinement. Though marked by worry and the unnatural pallor of enforced isolation, she retained the quiet strength that had enabled her to choose duty over desire in those crucial moments before her wedding ceremony. "I chose to honor my obligations," she said simply, her voice carrying both relief at rescue and profound sadness at the betrayal she had experienced. But someone else had already decided that my choice was irrelevant to their plans. The full scope of deception revealed. As they traveled back to London in the gathering dusk, the two young women provided the final pieces of a puzzle that had challenged even Poirot's considerable powers of deduction. Their testimony revealed a conspiracy that had exploited the deepest human emotions for purely mercenary purposes. Miss Carfax's account was delivered with the precision of someone who had spent her confinement analyzing every detail of her manipulation. Mr. Phipps approached me 3 months ago, expressing concern about Honoria's obvious unhappiness. He suggested that true friendship might require helping her find the courage to choose her own path, even if that path led away from family expectations. She described how Phipps had provided the correspondence from the supposed school friend in Edinburgh, explaining that Honoria was too proud to confess her doubts directly, but might respond to encouragement from someone she trusted. He had arranged her meetings with Mr. Davison, presenting him as a romantic soul who could provide both practical assistance and emotional support. Miss Honoria's voice carried the hollow tone of someone whose faith in human nature had been profoundly shaken. When I decided in that final moment that I could not abandon my family, regardless of my personal feelings, I believed I was choosing the harder but more honorable path. I never imagined that my choice would be overruled by someone who had been planning my disappearance regardless of my own wishes. She recounted how Phipps had appeared at the vestry after she had written her note to Sylvia, speaking with the persuasive authority that had served him so well in legal matters. A brief drive for fresh air before the ceremony, he had suggested. Time to compose herself before facing her obligations. The handkerchief he pressed upon her, ostensibly containing smelling salts, had carried a sweetness that turned to unconsciousness. The psychological aftermath. The revelation of Mr. Phipps's systematic betrayal sent shockwaves through the Ashworth family. Sir Edmund, confronting the reality that his trusted legal adviser had been embezzling family funds while orchestrating his daughter's disappearance, aged visibly as the full scope of the deception became clear. Lady Margaret, whose iron control had never wavered throughout the crisis, finally showed signs of the strain she had been concealing. "We trusted him completely," she said with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "He had access to everything, our financial records, our private correspondence, our most intimate family discussions." Julian Ashworth, whose financial difficulties had provided additional leverage for the conspiracy, confronted the reality that his gambling debts had been used as justification for a scheme that might have destroyed his sister's life. His usual nonchalance cracked entirely, revealing genuine remorse beneath his carefully maintained facade. Captain Pemberton, learning that his bride's disappearance had been orchestrated to prevent their marriage for purely financial reasons, struggled with complex emotions. "She chose duty over desire," he said with quiet dignity, yet someone decided that even duty could be overruled by greed. Justice and legal resolution. The evidence assembled through Poirot's methodical investigation provided prosecutors with a compelling case against Bernard Phipps. The physical evidence, wax impressions, forged correspondence, financial records, painted a clear picture of systematic fraud and conspiracy. The murder of Arthur Davison, committed when the florist became a liability, elevated the charges to capital crimes. Dr. Thornfield and his sanatorium faced their own legal consequences for accepting patients under false pretenses and maintaining their confinement without proper medical justification. The private institution that had profited from human misery would face scrutiny that would likely end its operations permanently. Poirot's final reflection. As the London fog swirled around the Ashworth townhouse that evening, Hercule Poirot reflected on the deeper implications of a case that had challenged his understanding of human nature. The conspiracy had succeeded not through violence or intimidation, but through the systematic exploitation of noble impulses turned against themselves. "The little grey cells, mon ami," he murmured to Jap as they prepared to conclude their investigation. They perceived that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand human psychology well enough to make virtue itself a weapon. Monsieur Phipps succeeded for so long because he understood that people could be manipulated through their own best qualities: loyalty, love, duty, friendship, rather than their weaknesses. He adjusted a photograph on the mantelpiece with characteristic precision, restoring perfect order to the room. "It is not so much that people are wicked," he observed softly. "It is that they are untidy in their thinking. One must arrange the motives as one arranges the flowers, each in its proper place, so that the whole may be seen as it truly is." The case had revealed the vulnerability of even the strongest individuals when confronted by someone who understood their deepest motivations and was willing to exploit them without conscience. Yet the resolution also demonstrated the ultimate triumph of truth over deception, of methodical investigation over elaborate conspiracy. Outcome and philosophical conclusion. The affair at St. Bartholomew's had reached its conclusion, but its lessons about the complexity of human nature and the dangers of unchecked ambition would linger long after the last echo of those ancient bells had faded into memory. The bride who had vanished before her vows had been restored to freedom, and the truth had emerged from the shadows where it had been so carefully concealed. As Poirot prepared to take his leave, he paused at the threshold and allowed his gaze to travel once around the ordered room. Cushions had been displaced and restored. Order had been re-established from chaos. Outside, Grosvenor Square lay quiet beneath the October stars, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Bartholomew's carried their ancient, forgiving music across the modern griefs of London. "Justice," Japp observed, with the satisfaction of an honest craftsman whose work had been soundly done. "Order," Poirot corrected gently, "and perhaps, if we are fortunate, a little wisdom. The truth, she is a delicate creature who does not flourish amid noise and confusion, but when properly tended, she grows into understanding." The psychological game had been played to its conclusion, and once again, the methodical application of logic and insight had triumphed over even the most elaborate criminal conspiracy. The little grey cells had served their purpose, and Hercule Poirot was content. Most. The amber light of late October filtered through the tall windows of the Ashworth drawing-room as autumn settled over London with its characteristic blend of melancholy and renewal. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic revelations at St. Bartholomew's, and the great city had begun to arrange the affair into neat columns of newsprint and legal verdicts, as it arranges all its scandals with efficient discretion and an appetite for the next sensation. The wheels of justice turn. Bernard Phipps, stripped of his professional dignity and the elaborate facade that had concealed his criminal enterprise, faced the full weight of English justice with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his fraudulent schemes. His trial at the Central Criminal Court drew considerable public attention, not merely for the dramatic circumstances of the case, but for the chilling revelation of how systematically trust could be betrayed by those in positions of professional responsibility. The evidence assembled through Poirot's methodical investigation provided prosecutors with an overwhelming case. The murder of Arthur Davison, the systematic embezzlement of family funds, the elaborate conspiracy to abduct and confine 2 innocent women, all were laid bare with the precision that had marked Phipps's criminal planning. His meticulous records, ironically, became the instruments of his own destruction, providing a detailed confession written in his own hand across years of carefully falsified documents. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one familiar with the evidence. Bernard Phipps was sentenced to death for the murder of Arthur Davison, with additional terms for fraud, conspiracy, and abduction that would have ensured his permanent removal from society even had the capital charge been reduced. The man who had sought to secure his retirement through elaborate criminal enterprise would instead meet his end on the scaffold, a victim of his own methodical thoroughness. Dr. Reginald Thornfield and his Millbrook Sanatorium faced their own reckoning as government investigators uncovered a network of similarly dubious confinements and unethical practices. The institution that had profited from human misery under the guise of medical treatment was permanently shuttered, its director struck from the medical register and facing criminal charges of his own. the carefully constructed world of discreet confinement, where inconvenient individuals could be made to disappear behind respectable facades, crumbled under the harsh light of public scrutiny. The restoration of lives. In the quiet aftermath of legal proceedings, the Ashworth family began the delicate process of rebuilding their lives upon foundations of hard-won wisdom rather than comfortable assumptions. Sir Edmund, profoundly chastened by the betrayal of his most trusted adviser, undertook the arduous task of disentangling his business affairs from Phipps's machinations. The experience transformed him from an imperious patriarch into a more thoughtful leader, one who understood that true security lay not in the accumulation of wealth, but in the cultivation of genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than mere obligation. Lady Margaret, whose iron composure had finally yielded to more human vulnerability, found herself confronting the limitations of her own control over family affairs. The realization that her daughter's unhappiness had been so profound as to make her susceptible to criminal manipulation forced a painful re-evaluation of the suffocating expectations she had placed upon her children. She began, tentatively but with genuine determination, to seek more authentic connections with both Honoria and Julian, acknowledging that love, not merely duty, had its rightful place in family relationships. Julian Ashworth, sobered by his sister's near tragedy and his own role as an unwitting pawn in Phipps's scheme, made sincere efforts to address the gambling debts and irresponsible lifestyle that had made him vulnerable to exploitation. Though the shadow of his past indiscretions lingered, there was a new maturity in his bearing, a quiet determination to forge a more respectable path that would honor rather than burden his family name. Honoria's choice and growth. Miss Honoria Ashworth emerged from her ordeal with a quiet strength that had been forged in the crucible of confinement and betrayal. The experience had stripped away the layers of expectation and obligation that had previously defined her existence, leaving her with a clear understanding of her own desires and the courage to pursue them despite social convention. She chose, with characteristic thoughtfulness, not to proceed with her marriage to Captain Pemberton. Though she held no ill will toward him and respected his honor and integrity, the circumstances of their engagement and the subsequent revelations had irrevocably altered her perspective on the nature of matrimonial commitment. Marriage, she had learned, must be entered freely and joyfully, not as a duty imposed by family obligation or financial necessity. Captain Pemberton, demonstrating the same honor that had earned him his naval distinction, accepted her decision with dignity and understanding. "You chose duty over desire once," he observed with gentle wisdom, "and nearly lost yourself in the process. I would not have you make the same mistake twice, even if the beneficiary were myself." He returned to his naval career with perhaps a deeper understanding of the human heart's complexities, but with his integrity unblemished and his respect for Honoria's character, if anything, enhanced by her courage in choosing her own path. New beginnings. Miss Sylvia Carfax, having recovered from her ordeal at the sanatorium, faced her future with the wisdom that comes from understanding how noble impulses can be corrupted by those without conscience. The guilt of her unwitting participation in Phipps's scheme weighed heavily upon her, but Honoria's forgiveness and unwavering friendship provided both healing and hope for redemption. With Honoria's encouragement and a modest inheritance from a distant relative, Sylvia established herself in a career that allowed her to channel her meticulous nature and keen eye for detail toward constructive purposes. Her small antique restoration business, specializing in delicate textiles and intricate lace work, quickly earned a reputation for exceptional quality and integrity, qualities that took on deeper meaning given her recent experiences. The friendship between the two young women, tested by crisis and strengthened by mutual forgiveness, became a source of support for both as they navigated their independent futures. They corresponded regularly, sharing not only the ordinary details of daily life, but the deeper insights that came from having confronted the darker aspects of human nature and emerged with their essential humanity intact. Poirot's final reflections. On a mild afternoon in early November, Hercule Poirot made his final visit to the Ashworth townhouse, finding the drawing-room restored to its former elegance but somehow lighter in atmosphere, as though the revelation of truth had lifted an invisible burden from the very walls. The family received him with genuine warmth, their gratitude evident not merely for his professional success, but for the gentle wisdom with which he had guided them through their darkest hours. "Monsieur Poirot," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying a humility that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, "we can never adequately express our gratitude for what you have done for our family." The Belgian detective adjusted his gloves with characteristic precision, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had been completed to his exacting standards. "Madame, I have done nothing more than arrange the evidence in its proper order, like flowers in a vase. The beauty was always there. It required only the removal of what was false to allow the truth to shine forth." He moved to the mantelpiece, making a final, almost imperceptible adjustment to a photograph's angle. "This case has reminded me once again that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand human psychology well enough to make virtue itself a weapon. Monsieur Phipps succeeded for so long because he exploited not your weaknesses, but your strengths, loyalty, duty, love, trust, turning each noble quality into an instrument of his criminal enterprise." The deeper lessons. "Yet," Poirot continued, his accent lending musical quality to his philosophical observations, "the resolution of this affair demonstrates that truth possesses an inherent power that ultimately overcomes even the most elaborate deception. The little gray cells, when properly applied with method and persistence, can illuminate the darkest corners of human duplicity." He paused, his remarkable mind already drawing broader lessons from the specific circumstances they had confronted together. "Consider how this conspiracy succeeded not through violence or intimidation, but through the systematic corruption of trust. Trust, mes amis, is the invisible architecture that supports all human interaction. When that trust is betrayed by those in positions of responsibility, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victims. It undermines confidence in the very institutions that make civilized society possible." Sir Edmund nodded gravely, his understanding deepened by painful experience. "We placed our complete confidence in Phipps because his position demanded it. The betrayal was so shocking precisely because it came from someone we had no reason to suspect." "Précisément," Poirot agreed. "Yet we have also witnessed the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when confronted with such betrayal. Miss Honoria chose duty despite her personal unhappiness, then chose freedom despite social pressure. Miss Carfax maintained her dignity despite manipulation and confinement. Each of you has demonstrated that character ultimately transcends circumstance." The elegant departure. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Grosvenor Square, Poirot prepared to take his leave from a case that had tested his powers while reaffirming his faith in the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. He paused at the threshold of the drawing-room, allowing his gaze to travel once more around the space where so much had been revealed and resolved. "The affair at St. Bartholomew's has reached its conclusion," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "But its lessons will endure long after the immediate crisis has passed. We have learned that the most effective crimes are often committed not by strangers in dark alleys, but by those who have been welcomed into our most private circles. We have discovered that virtue, when unguarded by wisdom, can become vulnerability. Most importantly, we have witnessed that truth and justice, when pursued with proper method and unwavering determination, will always triumph over deception and greed." He adjusted his hat with mathematical precision and stepped into the London evening, where the ancient bells of St. Bartholomew's carried their timeless message across the modern griefs and joys of the great city. Behind him, the Ashworth family began the continuing process of rebuilding their relationships upon foundations of authentic understanding rather than mere obligation. As the fog swirled around the gas lamps of the square, Hercule Poirot reflected with deep satisfaction on another mystery solved, another conspiracy unraveled, another demonstration that human nature, however complex, remained ultimately comprehensible to those with the patience and insight to read its deepest patterns. The bride who had vanished before her vows had been restored to freedom and choice. The truth had emerged from the shadows where it had been so carefully concealed. Order had been restored from chaos, and justice had been served with the elegant precision that marked all of his investigations. "The little grey cells," he murmured to himself as his cab carried him through the London streets toward his next adventure. "They are content, and perhaps, after such exertions, they have earned a brief holiday. One must never allow the dust of the world to settle too heavily upon the intellect, n'est-ce pas?" The affair at St. Bartholomew's had ended, but the legend of Hercule Poirot continued, carrying its eternal message that truth and justice would always triumph when properly pursued by those with the courage and wisdom to seek them. In the distance, the bells rang out their ancient song of hope and renewal, announcing not the wedding that had been prevented, but the enduring victory of light over darkness in the endless drama of human nature. Elaborate criminal conspiracy,